to log in. Is there a motion to open, is there a motion to open the public meeting?
So moved.
Is there a second? Is there a second?
Second, sorry, I was muted.
Very good, thank you. All in favor?
Aye. Or
Aye.
voting.
Oh, we're-
Aye.
Okay, and for the record, while we're waiting for Yorgos to come in.
No, I'm here.
Oh,
Brian,
very good.
yeah,
Okay,
I voted already, thanks.
okay.
I sent the vote. Weird.
I didn't get mine didn't, I didn't have an option.
Neither did I.
We didn't vote. We voted orally on that to start the meeting.
Oh,
Okay.
now I'm getting the vote.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
Oh,
Okay, well, it's unanimous.
there you
Very
go.
good. And for the public, the board opened the public hearing at 5:33. And at 5:34, there was a motion, a second, and all in favor to go into executive session. We were in executive session, and then there was a motion to come out of executive session for the purposes of discussing litigation at 6:28. A second, all in favor, and now we're here back into the public meeting. So we would move to item 3.1, which is the Pledge of Allegiance at this time. Bring in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
Allegiance to the flag
of the
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty, justice for all.
Okay, thank you. And welcome, everybody. I think we have 101 attendees from the public on tonight's meeting, along with our 17 panelists. So with that, I would move to agenda item 4.1. And I would just encourage anyone from the public, if your question relates to school opening, the superintendent is going to give us a report on school reopening, at which point we will then open up a forum where the public can ask questions, and Jeff and or the board or other administrators can answer them. But 4.1, if there's something other than school opening that anyone would like to discuss at this time. And Scott, with that, is there any hands?
Hold on one second, please. None that I can see.
Okay, very good. With that, I would move on to section 6 of tonight's report and turn it over to you, Jeff, for item 6.1 and 6.2, after which we will open up for public discussion.
So I don't have the agenda in front of me, Brian. Is that?
I'm sorry. So 6.1 is the Sag Harbor Learning Center update for superintendent's report.
Right. So 6.1, the Sag Harbor Learning Center update. The building is ready to be occupied at this time. As I've said in previous meetings, we're wrapping up construction of the retaining wall located in the rear of the facility, and that construction is on schedule to be completed prior to September 1. So our tentative plan is to house pre-K in the Sag Harbor Learning Center this fall, thus opening up some more space for the elementary grades to stay grades 1 through 5 in the elementary school and achieve social distancing. Any questions with regard to 6.1?
Board questions? Okay. Moving on to item 6.2, which is the reopening update and the superintendent's report.
So Scott, are you going to share that screen so we have some visual prompts for the audience?
Yep, it's coming up right now. Hang on 1 second. Try that again.
And I would just let the public know, for purposes of the meeting being recorded, that you can register to participate in the comments period, or if you'd prefer to just observe, the meetings are all live streamed on YouTube. So without registering, you can live stream the board meetings. And again, we will have board meetings tonight the 17th, tomorrow night, the 18th, and Thursday night, the 20th, all beginning at 6:30, which will allow for public input and a community forum, ask question and answer sessions. So I
Great.
see we have over 100 people tonight, which is great. And I want to thank you, Scott, for putting that together and managing this and smoothly and allowing everybody to participate. More than 100 people per every meeting for the last 3 meetings, which has been great. With that, we'll go back to Jeff. I see that the screen is up, and we'll go 6.2, the reopening update.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So tonight's agenda, I'll start with an update regarding contact tracing, COVID testing, and any relevant New York State updates. Then I'm going to turn it over to 2 subcommittees of the reopening task force that focused on masks and temperature checks. And then I'm going to provide a review of the reopening instructional models and touch upon what I think are some key considerations related to each scenario. So to start, about 2 weeks ago, the governor sort of threw a curveball with regard to 2 key issues, and those were contact tracing and COVID testing. Up until 2 weeks ago, districts were operating under the assumption that the Department of Health would take a lead role with regard to contact tracing and COVID testing. At a press conference, again, 2 weeks ago, the governor suggested that schools needed to take a lead role in both of those endeavors. He doubled down on those comments subsequently a couple of days later. Thankfully, we received some guidance from the Department of Health last week where it was restated that the Department of Health would be taking the lead role in both contact tracing and COVID testing, and they've issued guidance to suggest or guidance that outlines how that would go about happening. And basically, I'll start with contact tracing. If there's a reported positive test to the Suffolk County Department of Health, they will contact the school, and the school's role is to provide a comprehensive list of students, teachers, and staff that have been in touch with the person or the student who tested positive. They take the lead role from that point forward and do the contact tracing. With regard to COVID testing, the recent guidance from the Department of Health is that school districts are supposed to partner with community agencies and arrange for testing locations, but we're not supposed to conduct the testing ourselves. So our school nurses have done some outreach to some local health providers to set up options, and superintendents from school districts located in the towns of East Hampton, Southampton, and Shelter Island have a meeting scheduled on August 18th with the Vice President of Southampton Hospital, Robert Ross, and Dr. Fred Weinbaum, who's the Chief Medical Officer. I think the purpose of that meeting is to discuss testing, COVID testing, once we reopen school. The other significant developments were with regard to some mandates that New York State came out with, consistent with past mandates. It was sort of, I don't want to say rapid fire, but it was the expectation was that schools would comply pretty quickly. And the 3 things that schools had to post to their websites by last Friday were a remote learning plan, a COVID-19 testing plan, and a contact tracing plan. And I just talked about guidance from the Suffolk County Department of Health that impacted all 3 of those plans, and that guidance is reflected in what was posted to the website. In addition, the state said that between August 7th and August 21st, school districts had to have at least 1 meeting with teachers and staff, at which time we, school districts that is, offered an opportunity for people to ask questions about reopening and express their concerns. And school districts also had to hold at least 3 meetings with parents, community members, and stakeholders to afford those same opportunities to ask questions and express their concerns with regard to reopening. So those meetings, as Brian stated, for parents, community members, and stakeholders are Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday of this week. So those are the significant developments that took place within the last week. I do want to say 2 more things in the superintendent's update segment that I think are pertinent. One is that on the 11th of August, it was noted that there was a 90% increase in the number of COVID cases in children over the preceding 4 weeks. And I think that's important as it pertains to how we approach reopening. Another significant development emerged out of the University of Florida. There's an article in the New York Times that discovered, quote, unambiguous evidence that there is infectious virus in the air. So basically what they were able to do is, in a hospital setting, which has state-of-the-art circulation systems, air circulation systems, they were able to identify virus in the air between 7 to 16 feet from the infected person or patient, which is significant to the extent that schools, the guidance is that people stay 6 feet away in terms of social distancing. So if the 7 to 16 feet is valid, which at this point we believe it is, that sort of contradicts the guidance that we've received in terms of social distancing and how schools are supposed to operate. And that's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's just that the research and what we know about COVID and how it impacts people and how it's transmitted is evolving every day. And I just want to end, before turning it over to the task force to talk about masks and temperature checks, with some information that I read today from Dr. Anthony Fauci. And I'll quote him. He says, "We better be careful when we say young people who don't wind up in the hospital are fine, let them get infected. It's okay." He says, "No, it's not okay." And he goes on to say, "In individuals who are young and otherwise healthy, who don't require hospitalization but do get sick and symptomatic enough to be in bed for a week or 2 or 3 and then get better, they clear the virus, they have residual symptoms for weeks and sometimes months," he said during an American Society for Microbiology briefing. Fauci said subsequent checkups show that many have a substantially high proportion of cardiovascular abnormalities, evidence of myocarditis by MRI and PET scans, evidence of emerging cardiomyopathies. He said that it is really troublesome because it is evolving on a day-by-day basis. There are people that supposedly recovered from COVID-19. I'll guarantee you, if we have this conversation again 6 months to a year from now, we'll be reviewing the literature about talking about the long-term deleterious effects of non-hospitalized patients. So the reason I mention that is that as a superintendent of schools, and I think, the administrators all feel the same way, we have a responsibility to look out for the well-being of the students who are under our supervision. And parents trust us to make decisions that are in the best interest of their children. So on the one hand, we have the concern that we know that being out of school on a remote basis is not the healthiest thing for children. And we know that there's research out there that points to the detrimental effects that being not in school has on students. And yet we have emerging evidence that suggests that we really don't know the extent to which COVID-19 detrimentally impacts children. And so it's a very tough balance to achieve. And I just want to be very forthcoming with the parents who trust us with their children that this is a fluid situation. And if we were to say we know that we can provide for a safe environment and we know everything about COVID-19, that would be misleading because we don't. And everything is changing day by day. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the subcommittees of the task force to talk about two issues that are of importance. First being masks, and second, temperature checks. So let's start out with masks. Who is here to talk from the subcommittee regarding masks?
They need to raise their hand in order for me to know because we can't hear them right now.
Okay, please raise your hand. You're not seeing Scott?
I'm not, no.
Coming up as Nancy Halleck has her
Nancy Halleck has her hand raised.
Okay, let me scroll down. Sorry, it's a long list.
Yeah. 139.
I think she pops
Yeah,
up.
I'm not seeing her anymore. Oh, she's at the top. That's why. Thank you, guys. Go ahead, Nancy. Sorry about that.
No problem. So Jeff did, oh, I don't know how to change video, so you can just look at my smiley face, which is fine with me. So Jeff gave a pretty detailed update as to the newest information coming in, and when the task force met last week, he provided much of that information and discussing the research, discussing the newest information coming in, concerns from parents, preferences of both parents and staff in terms of their concerns. The task force overwhelmingly is recommending that masks be worn at all times during the school day, with times for mask breaks and obviously times for lunch, with special accommodations for the learners with special needs and any other specific situations as warranted, which would be decided upon through the appropriate channels. There's been discussion about shields, and in terms of shields, people can wear them, that is fine, but they would need to wear a mask underneath, because since this is airborne, a shield will not, it will be an additional safety measure, but it will not hold back the particles as effectively as a mask. We talked about the use of bandanas, use of gaiters, and as the studies have now shown, gaiters are not effective in preventing spread of the particles. Bandanas are very minimally effective. So in terms of wearing masks, it would be masks. The language is still to be specifically determined, but what research is showing is that masks made of 3 different layers of material is the most effective. So that's, I think, what we have from the task force regarding masks.
Nancy, can you talk a little bit about some of the research that you did regarding other districts?
Oh, and in terms of other districts in their plans for how they are, in terms of going back to school, which districts are having students wear masks at all times within the school, and which districts are requiring students to wear masks only on buses, in hallways, and at times that they can't be remote 6 feet from each other. From the 13 districts that I looked at from their reopening plans, it's split nearly 50-50 in terms of districts that are requiring masks at all times, with the exception of mask breaks and for special learners and for eating. But yeah, it really is 50-50.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Anybody else from the task force subcommittee or the task force in general, would you like to weigh in regarding masks?
I don't see anybody else, Jeff.
So then we can
Oh,
turn.
wait, I'm sorry. Heidi? Oh. Was Heidi on the task force, Jeff?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, that must be a comment for later. Go ahead.
Okay, so moving on to temperature checks and infrared scanners. We also established a subcommittee to focus on that. So I'd like to turn it over to Michelle Grant to talk a little bit about that, and she may have some of her other subcommittee members chime in as well.
Kira is ready to speak, it looks like, Jeff.
Okay, so Kira, wonderful.
Kira, can you hear us? You need to unmute yourself.
How about now?
There you
Yep,
go.
we can hear you.
Okay. Woo, okay. Thank you. The temperature screening subcommittee of the reopening task force discussed daily student temperature screenings at school. And the subcommittee heard requests from parents for temperature checks at school and how it would provide some comfort to know everyone would be definitely getting screened before coming into the school buildings. The New York State Education Department, in their guidance, recommends that daily health screening, including the temperature check, be done by a parent or guardian at home before school. The at-home daily health questionnaires and temperature checks are of utmost importance. Daily temperature screening at school would be meant as a double check and not meant to replace the one that's done at home prior to students coming to school. To accomplish the daily screenings at school, the school district would have to utilize a temperature scanning system like an infrared or thermal scanner that is capable of quickly screening students. The district would also need to work out the logistics of scanning each student and staff member prior to them entering the building. The subcommittee further discussed some of the limitations of using temperature scanners. The infrared thermal devices measure skin surface temperature, which can be lower than actual body temperature. Skin temperature can be affected by environmental temperature changes, and like a student who's waiting in the cold weather to be scanned may register a lower skin temperature and pass their screening, while their body temperature may in fact be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which would now be considered a fever. The infrared thermal thermometers are not medical devices, and true measurements of body temperature would need to be made with a medical thermometer. And infrared thermal devices are not effective at determining if someone has COVID-19. Remember that not all patients with COVID-19 will have a fever. Those positive for COVID-19 may be completely asymptomatic, but still spread infection, regardless of a normal temperature. Our reservations to screenings at school include handling pedestrian traffic flow and the location of the thermal scanners. Social distancing would need to be upheld during temperature screenings. Also, most scanners have an audible alarm setting when elevated temperatures are signaled. There needs to be a protocol in place to protect students and staff privacy when temperatures are out of range and entrance to the building is restricted. Also, will parents, faculty, and staff make substantial effort to accurately and legitimately complete the temperature taking process at home, or be less likely to do so knowing that students will be screened at school? And logistically, it will be hard to scan all the students and staff members before school, even with staggered drop-off times in a timely fashion. Issues including congregation, loss of instructional time, and social and emotional concerns will need to be addressed in the scanning protocol. So in closing, based on the reservations and limitations discussed, it was the consensus of the subcommittee and the reopening task force that the Sag Harbor Union Free School District would benefit from the use of a temperature scanning for all persons arriving on any of the 3 district campuses. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. That was pretty thorough. And I'll just add on that I think the collective thoughts of the group were that temperature scanning we're in favor of, but that we have to be very mindful of the extent to which implementing it would result in the congregation of students. So we have to be very thoughtful about setting it up in such a way that students aren't congregating at school entrances, and we'll be working on the logistics associated with that. I will say that I have checked with many Long Island districts, and although a number of East End districts are doing temperature checks, there are many districts in Nassau County that are not doing temperature checks. They're relying on the questionnaire, and then the questionnaire is triggering spot checks of students whose parents did not fill out the questionnaire on a given day. And some of that may be due to logistics in terms of the size of the school. But I just want the public to know that there is a lot of variability with regard to how districts are approaching this measure. There is no variability with regard to the questionnaire. The questionnaire is in place in all districts. The variability is with regard to whether or not all students are temperature checked, because I think there's a risk-reward equation there with regard to congregation and the benefits associated with temperature checks. Any questions about either masks or temperature checks at this time?
Jeff, I did see it, just if perhaps we could just explain what those mask breaks may look like, or what some of the thoughts are, so parents would have an idea of, the mask mandate policy at the school. What would that look like? And or for our special needs kids, would there, what would those accommodations look like? Perhaps you and or other administrators on could just weigh in so that
Sure.
may be, sorry, a little clearer to the public.
Sure. So I think that a mask break makes the most sense if students take that break outside. So the administrators will be working on setting up a schedule where students will periodically be able to go outside and take the mask break. The public should know, the school community, that these breaks will take away from instructional time. And it sort of segues into the other comment, which is that school is not going to look like what we traditionally know it to be. That COVID-19 has forced us to make adjustments that are going to require school looking different and feeling different, unfortunately, than what it normally feels like. With regard to the accommodations afforded to students with special needs, I'll turn it over to Carlene Mears, Dr. Carlene Mears, who's the director of PPS.
Thank you.
Yes, hi, good evening. Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Yeah, as far as special accommodations for students who may need that, we're going to be handling those on a case-by-case basis. So if a student needs an accommodation because of sensory issues or medical concern, we'll review those on an individual basis and come up with, sometimes there's things that we can do to problem solve that. And there's also options like more frequent mask breaks that could address some of those issues.
Thank you. There is a question on the chat in terms of how do we, deal with students who don't want to wear the mask. I think the guidance at this point is that we would treat each individual situation as such, and really consider it under the American Disabilities Act, which really calls for districts to engage in an interactive process where we consider the request, any relevant medical information, and then in consultation with our attorneys, make a determination as to whether or not there should be an accommodation. So we would proceed with each case in a very measured, thoughtful way so that we're consistent and fair.
Great, thank you.
There's another question here, Brian, with regard to how much instructional time would be taken from students while waiting for temperature checks. If I were to say I know at this point, that would be misleading. We're going to do our best to utilize multiple entrances and install temperature devices in multiple locations that can expedite the process and make it smooth. But It is a given that it will cut into instructional time, whether it's 15, 20, or 30 minutes, 40 minutes, we're not sure. We'll have to see how it goes. I have talked to other area superintendents, and they've hired temperature checkers to help with this monitoring process. But despite additional staff, it will eat into the day, having to go through that process each and every day with each and every student.
So Jeff, maybe there's one more question on the panelist. If you could address that, and then I'd open it up to the board with respect to mass and temperature checks, and then we will proceed to the reopening plans and have question and answer with respect to that.
So Brian, I just want to make sure that I don't miss a question. Which question is the one that you would like me to speak to? Because I'm trying to monitor this.
It was with respect to the enforcement of the mask mandate. So it's not enforceable or enforceable? Was the
It is
question, I believe.
enforceable. So
Enforceable. So I just want to be clear on that, that if we have a mask mandate and the child is not wearing a mask, they would not participate in the school, in-person school programming, correct?
correct. So if someone has a request for an accommodation, as per my previous comments, they would submit that request to the administration well in advance, along with the justification or the perceived justification for the accommodation. And we would view it under the umbrella of the American Disabilities Act, ask for any relevant information. And the key concept is engage in an interactive process where we determine whether or not there's an accommodation that's justified.
And with respect to that accommodation, just so that everybody's listening, both participating and on live YouTube, when would they have to make that accommodation request by? And does it go to the superintendent, or would it go to the building principal so they know who to make the request through?
It would go to the building principals,
Okay.
and then the building principals would take the lead, and the sooner the better. Because the reality is that each and every one of those requests are probably going to have a back and forth with requests for additional information that will be forwarded to the district's council, and then we'll work through each request individually to make sure we're consistent and fair.
Great. And I see one more question, then I'm going to open it up to board questions. So I'm just trying to keep the momentum. The question is, will the school be providing masks to kids sent without masks or that have issues or difficulties with masks? So we can speak to that point.
Yes, so the school, students are free to wear their own mask, bring their own mask to school. Someone mentioned earlier that the types of masks, there's some additional information out there about what works and what doesn't. So we may be involved in telling students that a particular mask is not up to the standards that the school requires. But in anticipation of that, two things will happen. Number one, we'll send out detailed information to parents prior to the start of school, outlining what constitutes a sufficient face covering. And number two, the district will have masks available for students who arrive to school either with a mask that's not sufficient or no mask because they forgot it.
Great. And with that, are there any board questions with respect to temperature checks or the mask mandate that administration is considering? God bless.
Thank you. Sorry.
I have a couple of questions. Surprise.
Shoot.
One is that if it's deemed that a child if there's been a request for an accommodation and the district grants it for a child not to wear a mask, will they be in a classroom with kids that are wearing masks?
Yeah, it's a good question. The details of that have to be worked out with the attorneys. But it's a good question because in granting the accommodation, we don't want to endanger other students.
Right.
Or members.
Or staff, obviously, or staff. And then my second question, which probably is just some heavy lifting we have to do between now and opening, but I think it would be helpful before we open for parents and students to understand that, you know, particularly with younger kids where it may be harder for them to keep their masks on because it's hard for them to do anything for an extended period of time. What is that process that's expected if there's an issue around wearing the mask, just, what kind of protocols, what kind of communication can be expected. I think it'll be helpful for not just staff, but for parents to understand that. And the earlier we can establish that, I think and maybe even have workshops for parents so they can prepare if they're choosing to send their children to school, to prepare those children to be able to, to follow what the expected behaviors are in a way that doesn't scare them. But, I think the more the children can be prepared, the less kind of frightened they'll be when they show up to school, right?
Yeah.
I think the more, and it's hard because obviously there's so much to do, but the more we can do sooner, I think the better.
Yep, I think those are fair comments, and we're working currently on trying to get out some videos to parents that sort of touch upon some of the issues you just referenced.
Any other board questions regarding or thoughts or board positions? So, for instance, my position is that individually, I feel that it is important to have the mask mandate, and that inside mask would be worn at all times. I think the data shows that the temperature check doesn't necessarily provide for or could give false readings, and effort and resources would be better spent on potentially increased custodial staff or increased overnight cleaning and cleaning versus temperature checking machines would be my thoughts with respect to those 2 points. So if board members want to share their position and or ask questions regarding those 2 points before we move on, now would be the time.
I have a question. Have we consulted with a medical doctor about the effects of having the children wear the masks all day?
I have not consulted with a medical doctor. I've just read the guidance from the Centers for Disease Control, the TC Public School of Health at Harvard.
Jeff, sorry to interrupt you. I'm reading the governor's guideline, and in there it says, responsible parties should allow students to remove their face covering during meals, instruction, and for short breaks, so long as they maintain appropriate social distance. So we're taking a different stance on this. So that's why I'm just wondering if we have looked at, the potential effects of children wearing the masks all day.
Yeah, and I think I just referenced, I don't mean to contradict you, but I just referenced what I referenced in looking at the data on masks. So the CDC, the TC School of Public Health at Harvard, and the recent research regarding the airborne capabilities of the virus to transmit, most notably the University of Florida study that I referenced in the beginning of my presentation. So all of those entities, from my perspective, point to the value of decreasing airborne transmission, which would suggest mask wearing is important. Looks like Alex has his hand raised.
Well, I just didn't know if Yorgos's point was finished. I want to let Yorgos finish first.
Okay. No, I mean, I was just reading like the guidelines from the Department of Health, and I know, a lot of other districts decided not to do like, the mask all day. That's why I was just wondering. I mean, I had experience in the past. I remember the previous cycle when it was NARS like years ago, and I was on a flight for like 8 hours with a mask, and in the end they had to bring me a oxygen bottle because I passed out. So I was just wondering, like, if we have issues moving forward, with kids really like not feeling good or whatever, if that's something we're gonna reevaluate, and if we had like any medical input on this. That's my thought. And then the second thing, Brian, you brought up about the temperature check. I do think that that's, another measure that we should take, because I feel, it's another checking point, and I feel it's useful. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Yorgos.
Thank you, Yorgos. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to express my very strong support for the mask requirement. I think the science is very clear and overwhelming on that now that it really works. And they're uncomfortable and they're unpleasant. It's a pain in the neck, but I think we need to think of it as not wearing a mask versus going to school the way we did in February, but wearing a mask versus having to keep our kids home, because I think it really will make a difference between, everybody wants our kids to go back to school and keep the transmission down as low as possible. And the best way to do that is by wearing a mask. So I express my strong support for that. I'm just, from what I've read, I see the temperature checks as not a very effective screening tool. Apparently it's a pretty low percentage of cases that present at the hospital that have them. And there's a lot of people that are asymptomatic. Also, it seems to me it's going to take a very long time to take all of these temperatures, and maybe raising some social distancing questions as well. And so we're all talking about trying to get our kids back in school for the needs to interact with their peers and have live instruction. Are we going to then spend a substantial part of that day taking their temperatures when they apparently are not a very effective way to screen anyway? So, but if that's what everyone wants to do, I guess I would defer to the administration on that, but I question the temperature screening. That's all I have to say.
Any other board members? Jordana's hand up, go ahead.
I just wanted to echo that I'm in support of masks all day. And I know that it can be really hard for some kids. And that's why I'm so glad that our school district is offering a remote option for everybody. So anybody who's philosophically opposed, or anybody who just thinks it's, problematic and they're able to keep their kids home, I think it's important that everyone remember that that option is available. I'm also fairly indifferent about the temperature checks. It's like, as Alex mentioned, I think it's only around a third of cases present with a temperature. So it's not an effective means for testing for COVID, but I also understand that we have concerns about parents doing temperature checks at home and whether they're going to be truthful about it. So, I'm fairly indifferent about it, but I do have a big problem with doing temperature checks at school for everybody if it is going to result in congregating or having kids waiting out in the rain before they enter the building.
I feel like I'm on Hollywood Squares, but the next square would be Sandy Cruel. Sandy, anything you'd like to add at this point?
I get the answer. No, I'm all for masks. I think it's important. I think that, the research does show that it does help. My concern is going to be with the older kids. I don't want to wear a mask, but I'm confident that our administration will handle that. And my other concern would be the type of mask that kids wear. So basically, it is my hope that we do have proper paper masks to hand out to kids who show up in a bandana or show up, like if you go to Sag Main, they put a towel across their face or what have you, just so that we have those ready for the kids. I mean, everybody's laughing, but that's what it goes. And as far as temperature checks, seen too many kids go to school, with lice, with pink eye, with strep throat. So for me, adding that one more layer of caution is good. And I think there's 11 doors at the Pearson Middle School, High School that you can separate by alphabetized, and probably 5 at the elementary school. And I heard something about staggered times at the elementary school. So I don't think it's going to take as much time as people think it is. It's going to be part of our new norm. That's the scary part. This is our new norm. So if we all work together, I think we can make it happen. So that's it.
And moving on the squares, all right. The bottom right, Ms. Shaver, Susan.
I'd like to say that I am in favor of masks. I wear a mask most of the time, most of my day, and I'm definitely in favor of it. I think it's positive. I think that we should be able to have a supply of masks for the students that come in and not have one. Maybe if we even threw in, I don't know how we feel about the hand sanitizers, but definitely masks. The temperature check, I could go either way. I think that it's definitely should be a requirement of a parent. I think that if it can be, maybe have a trial run to see what the concerns are, about testing it in school. But if we could have maybe a trial run to see how that goes, to see about the congregating, to see about the time frame that it takes. So that's just the way that I feel.
And Chris?
In terms of masks, obviously that has helped New York get in a much better state. I'm supportive of it. I do acknowledge that it's going to be very challenging for students of all grades, and that we as a district have to be very thoughtful about giving them those breaks. And I hope, that I know it can be traumatic for kids. So I think the more that parents can work with the district to have their children prepared, the less traumatic that will be. In terms of temperature checks, I respect that only a small percentage will show up with temperatures. The majority may not have that as a symptom. As I've said previously, even if it only catches a handful of cases this fall, I feel like there's such a benefit to that. I know that we're going to be relying on families to fill out those forms. I am relatively confident that there are going to be families that don't fill them out accurately, or that their teenager has filled it out in the parking lot because mom and dad left for work already, or they forgot, or whatever. So even though it may not catch most of the cases, if it only catches one or two, that might be a big difference to the health of somebody else in the district. So I'm in favor of it. I like Susan's idea of a trial. I think we're going to be very thoughtful about how we create that so that there's not congregation. And a trial makes sense to me, to say, hey, let's see if we can do this in a way that doesn't endanger children and staff and is intelligent.
Thank you, Chris. Jordana?
I just wanted to raise just one issue. If we were to have all of the entrances open for like temperature checks, are we going to have to hire a bunch of security guards for all those entrances?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I don't think I would utilize all the entrances because it creates a logistical concern. I'm also concerned with finding the personnel who are willing to be temperature checkers. So currently I'm thinking 3 or 4 entrances at most, and hoping to get a couple of people at each. In talking to the other school districts, they're limiting the number of entrances as well, and are also concerned with the very same issues of finding people who are willing to be, quote, temperature checkers, because that's not the safest thing to be doing.
Is there any other board questions with regard to these points? Otherwise, I would, before we do that, there was a question Jeff posed. It seems to be for administration, so I would say you, Matt, and Brittany, or could someone discuss the protocols around location and social distancing during lunch? If kids are eating and talking next to each other without masks, it seems an opportunity where the virus could easily be transmitted.
Yeah, and I don't have an easy answer for that. The two choices are to have students sit in their classrooms and be socially distanced. So again, we've committed to 10 to 12 students per class, which allows us to achieve that 6-foot distance, which we think is preferable, especially at the middle school, high school level, to having students in a lunchroom. I've spoken to other school districts who are actually having their students in a lunchroom eating lunch. I'd like to say that we could take all the students outside for lunch every day, but that's not realistic either because that's weather dependent. And you've also got transition times to get everybody out and in. So the reality is at this point, the plan is to have students eat for the most part in their classrooms, and we'll do the best we can during that time frame with what we have to deal with.
Great. There are some other questions coming up, but they deal more with the reopening plan. So I think we should address those after we hear from administration. So if there's no more board questions.
Hey, Brian, I just have one question. I know since we mentioned the temperature check, that it might take like more people that need to deal with it. Have we looked in the option also of like the walkthrough temperature machine?
Yeah, good question, Yorgo. So what we're talking about, or tentatively talking about, is a situation where students would walk up and take their wrist and put it into a device that measures the temperature. And that is a relatively quick process. And then if they're identified as having a temperature above 100, then that triggers a second checking. So it wouldn't actually be people taking a thermometer and checking your head. It would be students taking their wrist and putting it into a device that's posted on a
Okay, got it.
wall.
Okay, with that, I would ask that there was a question with respect to masks that do we know or anticipate how many breaks would happen throughout the day? Mask breaks, that is, to be specific.
We haven't gotten to that granular level of detail.
Okay.
We're aware that we have to accommodate, and what we'll probably do is talk to a lot of our peers in other districts and reference some organizations, whether it's the Department of Health or the CDC, and see if there's any guidance we can follow.
Great. So I would say with that, unless there's another board question, then we would move to the reopening scenarios. And if you could hit on those, Jeff, with the administration.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thank
So,
you.
Scott, can you put those up?
Yeah, I'm working on that right now.
Thanks.
Jeff, while that is going up, if you know, in the reopening plan, if you want to just discuss dates as to, I saw some questions online as to when families need to notify whether they're going to be in person, remote only, or if you could address that during your presentation.
So we're going to be sending out a survey the latter half of this week. We wanted to have these 3 meetings to get parent feedback, but we are anticipating sending out something towards the end of the week, asking parents to identify whether or not they elect to enroll their child in in-school, in-person sessions, or whether or not they intend to have their children study remotely. Having that information will enable the school to plan more efficiently and effectively for the first day that students are scheduled to arrive, which is Monday, September 14th. There are some follow-up questions that have been posed pertaining to how often or what's the minimum amount of time that a student or a family has to stay in a selected option. So to give you an overview, there are some districts that are saying if you elect to, for instance, choose remote, you have to stay in that for a minimum period of time. For instance, 5 weeks or a marking period or something like that. Sag Harbor is not choosing that arbitrary measure. And I understand, practically speaking, why people do that. But our solution is to say to parents that we will accommodate the request and do our best to accommodate the switch while adhering to or while prioritizing the safety of all concerned. So for instance, if a family elects to start the year with a remote learning experience, and then let's just say 3 or 4 weeks into school contacts the administration and says, we'd like to go in person, it may take a couple of days or a week for the administration and the school to do the type of shuffling, if necessary, to make sure that we can adhere to social distancing while having that student join his or her peers in in-person instruction. So big picture, we're going to do our best to accommodate the requests, but we're saying to the public that occasionally we may require days, perhaps a week, to switch things around to make it work. The alternative, again, that some districts are following is setting minimum requirements or minimum periods of time that a student has to remain in a particular model of instruction. And I'm not sure, number one, whether school districts can legally do that, because if I wanted to attend in-person instruction and there was just an arbitrary minimum date set, I'm not sure that's defensible. So we are going with the model that I just talked about. Would you like me to go into the reopening instructional models?
Yes, I would.
Okay. So let me start out by saying that if a family decides to have their child elect to study remotely, there will be 2 remote programs, one for the Sag Harbor Elementary School and one for Pearson High School. The Pearson High School middle school program, I said high school, it's really middle school, high school, will be synchronous live instruction, and which means basically that students who elect to stay at home will be following the classes that are taking place in school. So there'll be a live feed, and we've made inquiries already and are prepared to spend the funds necessary to have cameras installed in the classroom and have microphones provided for teachers where they can hear not only the students in the class, but those students who are studying remotely. Mr. Malone, do you want to provide a quick overview of the elementary program that you envision?
Sure, happy to do so. Good evening, everyone. So if a family were to select the remote option from the beginning, based on the preliminary data that we have, obviously this could change slightly once we receive the survey results that Mr. Nichols spoke to, but our plan is to group students preferably by their grade level and have them in a remote class or remote cohort, so to speak. And the children would follow a structured daily schedule, which would include direct instruction from the teacher or whole group instruction. Then based on a lot of the feedback we received in the spring from both teachers and parents, I would say, as well as students, the idea of some smaller group instruction, 1 to 4 students receiving follow-up instruction in the subject area. That's something we're going to employ. And then we also believe strongly in consistent feedback as well as guidance from the teacher. So there will be time devoted each day for children to receive that individual guidance as well as that important feedback. I think it's important that parents understand that within the remote model, it's inherent that there's a expectation that children will be doing some work independently. Obviously, younger students would need adult assistance with that, but there will be a commitment and like I mentioned at the beginning, a structured schedule that provides the whole group direct instruction, small group, as well as the guidance and feedback from the teacher each day.
Thanks, Mr. Malone. The Pearson Middle School, High School will be significantly different from last year in that students who elect to study remotely will be following a bell schedule. So last year there were minimum numbers of teacher live contacts with students. This year it's much more structured, where there's actually a bell schedule where a student will follow it throughout the day and will be instructed by the teacher in a live setting. They'll receive grades where last year they did not receive grades. And as I've said before, despite these changes and a lot of professional development that's taken place already and will continue to take place through September 14th, it doesn't replicate the experience that students have coming to school each day. So that covers the first slide.
And for,
Go ahead.
sorry to jump in, but as for grades, the middle school, we're looking to make sure that we're hitting the social emotional piece as well as the curriculum, because we know that this is going to be a very different environment for children. And we want to make sure that we're keeping that happiness and learning the empathy that you need in middle school. So grades will be given for the high school courses. We are still deciding on if we're going to do be pass or fail for the middle school, because we just want to make sure that they're hitting those soft skills as well as those curriculum standards and guidelines.
Great. Thank you. Next slide, Scott. So what I'd like to do is to go over the 4 different scenarios. And before I do that, at the beginning of the evening, I referenced Dr. Fauci's words or his recent comments today regarding the dangers that we don't really fully comprehend yet with regard to how COVID affects younger people. And the purpose for mentioning that is not to advocate that we don't open school or that we do open or whatever. The purpose for mentioning it is to just make sure that the community is aware of the many uncertainties that exist out there with regard to how this virus impacts our children. The community charges me as superintendent and the administrators and the teachers with the care of your children. And I just want to make sure that everybody fully understands the many unknowns out there with regard to this virus. On the one hand, you have the uncertainties I just spoke about. On the other hand, we know that students not being in school also has detrimental effects, social, emotional effects, and there are studies that are coming out each and every day speaking to the negative impacts of students not coming to school. So our job, from my perspective, is to just present the information so that you have a comprehensive view of what we're looking at when we make decisions about how to proceed. So with model number 1, I won't talk a lot about that because we just talked about it, which is a fully remote instructional model. We're not going to go with that to start the year unless conditions between now and September 14th necessitate it. But currently, New York's test positive rate, I think Long Island was 0.6% today, and New York City was below 1%, and across the state was well below 1%. So with test positive rates where they're at, I don't think model number 1 is something that we should proceed with. Model number 2 is our initial recommendation. And can we go on to the next slide, Scott? Next slide. So model number 2, which is what I'm talking about right now, pre-K through 9, those students would be in school every day. They'd be placed in cohorts of 10 to 12. Lunch would be served in classrooms. Masks, we talked about that this evening. My recommendation, which I didn't share, I let the committee make their recommendation. My recommendation would be that masks be worn at all times with mask breaks and temperature checks entering school, recognizing that it's certainly not a strategy without faults or without holes, but as per Chris Tice's comments, it very well may in fact pick up some cases that we normally might not pick up. Grades 10 through 12, in this scenario, it would be remote instruction. The students follow a bell schedule. They provide live instruction every day of the week. Grades will be given and assessments will be given online. The positives associated with this model, it's aligned with the guidance that comes from the CDC and the Harvard School of Public Health, as well as many other institutions that have expertise in this area that prioritize getting younger students back to school. The other reason for doing this is that at grades 10 through 12, it's very, very difficult to cohort students, and I'll get into that a little bit later. The negatives associated with this model, and we heard very clearly from the community, is the lack of in-person instruction and the lack of having students in school can have detrimental effects to their emotional well-being. And I think that's been documented from a research perspective more frequently in the past couple of weeks. Let's move on to model number 3. Model number 3 is the model that is being followed probably in about 95% of the schools in New York State. And basically it's pre-K through 8 every day, students in cohorts of 10 to 12 students, lunch in classroom, masks at work, masks at all times, and temperature checks. And then students in grades 9 through 12, and in many districts, it's not 9 through 12, it's 7 through 12. But we think we can get students through 8th grade in. Students in grades 9 through 12 will follow a bell schedule, and basically one group would attend school on Monday and Tuesday. The other half of students would attend school on Thursday and Friday, and Wednesday would be a remote instruction day. Hallway transitions are closely monitored. Lunch is served in the classrooms. There's masks worn at all times and temperature checks. What it ultimately results in is remote instruction 3 days per week and in-person instruction 2 days per week. Now, the pros or the positives, or it allows for all course offerings. And when I say all course offerings, almost all. The core courses will be offered. Some elective offerings may not be offered. But the significant negative in all districts that I've spoken to, and again, 95% of the districts in New York State are doing this, is that it's impossible to cohort students in grades 10 through 12. And the reason for that is that a student, let's say, who is enrolled in math in 10th grade, they could be taking algebra, they could be taking geometry, they could be taking algebra 2, and they're all at different levels. And that same type of variability exists not only in mathematics, but in science, where they could be taking biology, chemistry, physics, or earth science. In social studies, where they could be taking, depending on their grade level, IB social studies offerings, AP social studies offerings, honors social studies offerings, or regular social studies. And then in English, it's simply IB, honors, or regular. So English is probably the easier to cohort, but the other 3 content areas are impossible. So to wrap up my thinking, 9 through 12 is the most common, the model that most districts are going with, but it's important to recognize that the concept of cohorting is not existent. Can we go to model 3B? Okay, so I just talked about how cohorting would not be possible with this model. What I wanted to do is to put up a slide to talk about what that would look like if we said, you know what, we're gonna make it happen, we're gonna do it. So here's what it would look like. If I was a student in basically 10, 11, 12, because 9 is relatively easy to cohort, all students would sit for the same math course, all the students would sit for the same English, social studies, and science. So if I was a student in 11th grade and I wanted to take chemistry, if the 11th grade science course was not chemistry, I might actually either not have a science or have to repeat a science that I already took. Or if I was in 11th grade English and I was scheduled to take IB English, I would not necessarily be able to take IB English if in fact the course for 11th grade English is just Regents English. So if you make a choice to cohort, which Model 3B speaks to, then you're drastically reducing the number of course selections. So no high schools that I'm aware of have gone with Model 3B because of what I just described. School districts that are going with Model 3A, which is the hybrid, are recognizing the fact that cohorting is not feasible at the high school level. And those are consistent with comments I've made from the very, very start. Can we move on to Model 4? Model 4 is a scenario where students in pre-kindergarten through 9 come to school every day, and then grade 10 comes period 1 through 4, period 5 is a cleaning day, and grades 11 and 12 come period 6 through 9. And this scenario has students coming every single day of the week. So the students in grades 10 through 12 come for an abbreviated day every day. We could accommodate some more course variability. So we could have some cohorting in this scenario, but it would require large cohorts where we might have to combine, for instance, IB English, if there are 2 sections with 45 kids in one setting, like a gymnasium or an auditorium. And we've gone through and we can do this, but I think that the bottom line is, if you go back, Scott, to 3A, this is, at this point in the process, what my recommendation, if conditions don't change on the ground, this is my recommendation in terms of what to go with. And I'll qualify this statement in the following way. Although model number 2 was my initial recommendation, and I based that recommendation on the available science at the time, and the science really hasn't changed, and yet it has, because we have more evidence now about the detrimental effects of students staying home, that they're more likely to suffer from depression, from anxiety, and God forbid, they would act on some of those negative feelings that they have. So that additional science to me suggests that we should consider that in trying to come up with a different scenario. And that different scenario is what the majority of school districts in New York State, more than the majority, like 95% are going with, which is model 3A. I just want the public to be very, very clear that the extent to which we can cohort is greatly minimized. There will be some elective offerings with model 3A. It will not be a normal high school schedule. Some people will ask, well, if you're not cohorting, then how come you can't offer everything? And the answer is, we can't offer everything because we have to adhere to social distancing, which means that a class of 20 is going to be cut down to 10, and we're going to have to repurpose staff to assist with supervision. So if a class of English 10, which had 24 students in it, is now 2 sections of 12, then perhaps an elective teacher, whether it's an art teacher or a phys ed teacher or a music teacher, might have to be repurposed to help with supervision, and they will not be free to teach all of the elective offerings that they normally teach. So we'll offer those that we can after we do the schedule and the math, but I want to prepare the public, and this is not specific to Sag Harbor, that the number of elective offerings will be reduced. So that's a summary. Scott, can you go to the last slide, please? I don't know if there's anything after 4. I don't think there is. Am I correct?
That is correct.
So that's a summary of the 4 scenarios, and I tried to offer as much information and insight into the administrator's thinking. I'm happy to answer any questions from the board at this time.
My thought is, unless there's direct board questions quickly, the public has been waiting and we should hear from the public, but board questions first. Is there anybody? Sandy?
Yeah, just have a quick one.
Yeah.
Jeff, on model 3A for 2 and 3 remote, how does that affect a child with an IEP or special ed?
So a student who is has an IEP, an individualized education plan, or is an ENL student, students who are learning English, they are prioritized. So they're in their instruction, they'd be coming into school every day.
Okay.
So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify 2 things. So one, I know, there's still discussions about whether in middle school they'll have grades and, what kind of, I know Matt Malone mentioned that there'll be feedback from teachers at elementary school levels. I just wanted to kind of, for the public's benefit, just for elementary and middle school, even if there aren't grades, even if that doesn't happen, kids will still be assessed regarding reading level, and just kind of, it's not just feedback, but they'll actually have some kind of standard-based assessments.
So why don't we start with Ms. Carriero at the middle level?
Yeah, so we're still going to make sure that we're hitting all of our standards, but we understand that it has to be a balance. Our kids are going into a very different environment during this pandemic, and we want to make sure we're nurturing that. We saw a lot of that from the band-aided remote learning that we did. We did our best, but I think we could have done better. So we were thinking of a pass-fail system with very detailed feedback, or grades in a certain way that are just a little bit more structured and not as assessment driven. I worked at a school, the New York City Lab School, that had this model, and it worked really well for our middle schoolers, and it was a high achieving school. So it's a project-based learning environment instead of an assessment driven, but we'll still be assessing what reading level they're going to be on. We're still going to be assessing if they're going to be hitting the math standards they need and those core science skills they need to be successful in their high school level coursework. And especially their writing skills as well as the soft skills of communication.
Thank you, Ms. Carriero. Mr. Malone.
Sure. At the elementary school, like at the other two buildings, our focus is going to be on maintaining the structure and routine for the students. And part of that will be regular attendance, daily attendance. And we do plan at this point to have our progress reports as well as report cards. It may be something that we fine tune a little bit as we go along and see how that goes and get feedback from everyone involved. And as well as what Ms. Sobey brought up, we'll be doing our reading assessing and different assessments throughout the work time.
Great, thank you. And then the only other thing I was hoping, Jeff, if you wouldn't mind just touching upon, just because I've seen throughout this night, there's just been tons of messages in the chat about use of outdoor space. And if you could just talk a little bit about too, the fact that, kids that are going to be doing synchronous learning at home need to be able to access their teachers. So if their teachers are outside, they might not have Wi-Fi or cameras, and that we also have shared staff between middle and high school, making it just kind of some of those limitations regarding the outdoor space generally would be helpful.
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up. So I want people to know that we started exploring the notion of outdoor space months ago. So we looked into through the Office of Facilities Planning at New York State, what is required if we wanted to, for instance, have tents? What's required if we wanted to repurpose other buildings in the community? And I've gone over this before, but there are definite permitting requirements that, although the state has relaxed, we're still dependent, or we're still required to adhere to certain code requirements, which make it somewhat prohibitive. More relaxed than in the past, but prohibitive. In terms of staffing, though, there are definitely considerations with regard to moving off-site. So I would, if we were to, for instance, use a facility located in town, I would want to have a school nurse present. I would want to have school security present. We have a lot of shared staff. About 80% of the staff at the middle school, high school are shared. So they would have to transport between the buildings, which could incur additional cost if we had to pay for additional time, as well as the positions I just mentioned. And then, of course, as per Jordana's comment, if we have synchronous live instruction, then it's very, very important that the teachers are teaching in a spot where we have the technology available to be able to live stream what they're doing. So for instance, this afternoon, Scott Fisher, who's the director of technology, through a lot of hard work, has looked at alternate vendors, and we've made arrangements to purchase roughly $50,000 worth of microphones and cameras to make this synchronous learning workable in September. If we were outside where the internet access would not be comparable, that synchronous instruction would not be possible. So again, I think there are a lot of considerations with regard to going outside. I get the benefits of it, and we've certainly given it a lot of thought. And if we could make it work seamlessly, I know that science suggests it's something we should do, but in our research, we run into a lot of roadblocks related to staffing, technology, synchronous learning, that make the opportunities for it to be pursued pretty limited.
Thank you for clarifying. And so just making it like, crystal clear, that doesn't mean that kids are not going to go outside. As you mentioned earlier in the presentation, masks breaks will preferably be outside, but just instruction likely would not take place outside.
Correct. And the other thing to know with regard to Sag Harbor is there are many districts on Long Island that are not offering synchronous instruction or a remote option. So there are districts on Long Island that may change between now and mid-September, but I saw survey numbers this morning that said roughly 40% of the districts on Long Island are offering the in-person option, and that's it. If you don't choose that option, you have to go with a remote learning option. You have to go with a homeschooling option. So the remote option in 40% of the districts on Long Island is not even relevant. So the fact that Sag Harbor has made that an option from the start, I think speaks to the district's commitment to give people choices, which is a positive.
I agree.
Thank you.
Any other board questions? All right, with that, I would turn it over to the public. Scott will take questions from the public as they come in when the hands are raised. And to remind everybody from the public, you just need to state your name, not your address, and you'll have 3 minutes. So with that, Scott, if we could take the first hand raised.
Okay, first one up is Wendy Flanagan.
Hi, Wendy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much.
Great, you have 3 minutes, Wendy. Just give us your name and thank you for coming.
Okay. Wendy Flanagan. Thank you to everyone for all your time. Just a couple things that I have questions on and then just a couple opinions. Personally, our daughter Grace is going into 10th grade, and for consistency, we would like to see her attend the option 4, which would put her into school 5 days a week. And then also that would eliminate eating in school, since that seems to be a concern. Second, with the 3A option where they would be put into cohorts, is there any talk of possibly not having Wednesday as a remote learning day and alternating so kids are in 3 days 1 week and 2 the next? I know they talked about having the building cleaned on that Wednesday, but if the other buildings and the middle school area are not having the deep clean,
Excellent.
I'm not sure why the high school would need it. I would think that all buildings would need the deep clean day. So maybe we could alternate 3 days on, 2 days off. And then if we do the 3A option, is it possible to, not to add another layer, but to possibly recommend that their child be with certain peers so that on their off days, they can try to get together in their own social groups to do their remote learning to keep the social emotional piece intact? And then is there any talk among the administration and the board that if the numbers in New York stay on this downward trend, to revisit it at a certain point to maybe increase the amount of time that the high schoolers are in the building? Thank you.
Brian, you want me to try to tackle some of those?
If you could, Jeff, if you know, if not, we could always circle back with answers tomorrow or Thursday.
Yeah, I think with regard to the comment about the cleaning on Wednesdays, part of our thinking is that based on the science, that the older kids are more likely, to succumb to the negative impacts of the virus, and so that is part of the rationale for doing a little more cleaning there. The other rationale is that if we're breaking them into 2 different groups, and that's the extent of the cohorting that we can do, recognizing that there's limited cohorting in a traditional sense, then having Wednesday be that cleaning day means that when the kids come in Thursday and Friday, they're only dealing with the germs from that half of the student body versus 100%. So I understand your question, but that's the answer with regard to that. I think that with regard to a future re-examination of what test positive rates are and the implications for school, I think that the spectrum has two sides. So if the test positive rate goes up and we have to go with a more restrictive environment, then we'll do that. But conversely, if the test positive rate continues to trend downward, we certainly can look at loosening some of the restrictions as well and returning to a more, quote, normal pre-March 2020 environment.
Great.
Okay, so next up we have Emily Whites.
Hi, Emily, can you hear us?
Hi, I can. Can you hear me?
We can. Just state your full name first. Don't give us your address. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Emily Whites McLean. And I have 3 questions and points I wanted to make. First of all, thank you all so much for everything that you're doing. I really appreciate it. I know it's been a really difficult time for all of you and for all of us together as a community. We love being a part of this community, and we really want to find solutions together. So I want you to know that we are in it with you. And, you know, I know we all have our kids' best interests at heart. So, you know, as you're making these decisions, I hope that you'll lean on the parents in the community. I've talked to so many parents who, you know, want to help figure out the best solutions. And so I've written to you, but just to make it public for everyone, one of the things that's most important to me is making sure that our kids do get outside much more than they would in a normal year. You know, I think this is an opportunity in some ways. It's obviously not one we would ever ask for, but it's an opportunity to be creative and to use our small size as an advantage. And, you know, I think we have a lot of space. And there are a lot of ways that we can maximize our outside space. I understand the actual instruction time, if that needs to be inside, I'm fine with that personally. I really appreciate what Ms. Carriera was saying about, you know, the emotional component of this time. And I hope that we'll really keep that as a top priority for our kids. And to that end, I think getting outside is probably the healthiest thing they can do throughout the day. So not in terms of instruction, if that doesn't work, in terms of logistics, I totally get that, but, you know, maybe mandating that the garden is a part of everybody's curriculum this year. Doing, I said this in a letter, but I will publicly volunteer to offer yoga classes as many times per week for free to as many students as I can reach. We can do that 6 feet apart outside until late November. And I would love to do that for all of the students. And I'm sure there are other yoga teachers in the community. I'm sure there are other people who teach other things in the community who would be happy to do that. I'm sure there are some screening things that we would have to go through. But, you know, we would do whatever is needed to make sure that we can help to provide those kinds of outlets for our kids so that they can get outside and breathe fresh air throughout the day. Second thing I wanted to ask is, well, this is a really quick point. Just in terms of the younger kids, I have a daughter who's going into 1st grade, and because of the mask, I think it'll be really challenging to step back in, especially after really being out of school for 5 to 6 months by the time we get back. And so if, you know, they could be in the same class that they were in last year with the same kids, like she could start 1st grade with her kindergarten class, I think that might give a sense of familiarity. Thank you. That was
Thank you. Got it right in. Jeff, you don't have to respond as quickly, but if we have some answers there, that'd be great.
Yeah, Emily made some good points about getting outside more than a normal year, looking for ways to maximize the space that we have, to value, to focus on the emotional component. She talked about the garden curriculum and yoga classes and expressed her willingness to volunteer. So I do think that it's fair to say that we're going to prioritize getting kids out more than normal being more than what it was pre-COVID. Part of that is due to the fact that we won't have as many course offerings, and so there will be gaps in the schedule. Part of it is also knowing that it's healthier outside for kids, both from a virus transmission perspective, but maybe from a social emotional piece as well, or perspective as well. So we'll have more specifics on what that looks like, but know that in our planning, both at the elementary, middle, and high school, we anticipate students will be outside more than in a normal school year.
And next up is Jim Kinnear.
Sure, Jim, can you hear us?
Hi.
Hi, Jim.
Can you hear me?
Just give us your full name, not your address, and you have 3 minutes.
James Kinnear, President of the Teachers Association. Many of the points I wanted to bring up are there very much seems to be a consensus on, so I'll mention them and not belabor them. In terms of masks, we advocate for wearing masks all day. That seems to be the consensus. We understand that some students would have an IEP or a 504, which would exempt them from this. And so an issue for us is teachers that work with those students would need to have proper protection, seems to me additional protection, and alternate methods of working with those students so as to keep the teacher safe. Mr. Nichols mentioned that the distancing issue and that perhaps 6 feet is not sufficient, that it might be 7 to 16. That's a new issue is my understanding. Cohorting, I understand how at the high school level, it is practically impossible to cohort there. And so the issue becomes passing time. And with high school students, it's going to be how does passing time in the hallway be monitored? Who is going to be monitoring them? Who's going to be reminding students to wear their masks during the passing time? This would be the worst time to, is it possible to put the clock up on the screen like it was before to see how much I have left? And so perhaps the passing time could be increased from 3 minutes, and we could stagger the passing time so as to minimize how many students are in the hallway. I did see a picture recently of the New York City subway system and thought, gee, that's they're doing it down there. Why can't we? But in the subway system, they have the air changing 3 or 4 times as much as we will in our buildings. So passing time is a crucial issue. We've all seen the stories in the newspapers and on TV about colleges and schools across the country that are closing after only a week. And there's major outbreaks in different portions of the country. And obviously, the question is not so much do we want to start the school year in the school building, but what we really want to do is finish the school year in the school building with everybody being healthy. And so there's lots of issues. I realize the emotional wellness of the students is certainly a very serious issue, but the passing time is something I think needs to really be addressed.
Thank you, Jim. Jeff?
I don't think I need to summarize too much. I think with passing, we're working on specifics in terms of one-way hallways, one-way staircases, whether or not that's doable in different parts of the building. I've talked to other area principals to get how they're approaching it, and we're in the process of setting that up. As per previous comments, we will be sending videos home to families prior to the start of school so that when students come into school, they're familiar with the protocols and the expectations so that we can do the best we can to assist them in being safe and knowing what's expected of them. What other districts are doing is they are releasing certain portions of the class like a minute and a half apart. So it's not unusual if you had a class, let's say, of 12 students, for one group of 4 to be dismissed, and a minute and a half later for another group of 4, and then a minute and a half after that, the last group of 4 to be dismissed, thus limiting the amount of students in a hallway. I mentioned the notion of one-way hallways. A number of our hallways are wide enough that we could have two-way traffic, but students would have to be in lanes that we will mark on the floor so that 6 feet can be achieved. I think I've mentioned this in previous meetings, but we will not be having students access their lockers. So we'll have a student will not be expected to carry a large number of books. Each student will receive a Chromebook at the beginning of the year, which is a significant departure from how we've done it in the past. So every student, K through 12, will have a Chromebook, which will be their main textbook, if you will, or source of information, thus limiting the extent to which, number one, we would have to share those devices, and number two, carrying around different textbooks or things like that, knowing that we don't have a place to store them. So I get the negative impacts and understand the negative impacts of screen time. But the one-to-one Chromebook initiative for this year makes sense until things improve.
And how will those be distributed, Jeff?
We're working on that with Scott Fisher. They may be distributed at the beginning of the year during the first week of school, perhaps before. The details of that need to be worked out. Big picture, we're in a very good situation because we have enough on hand to accommodate each and every student, and Chromebooks are on back order. So if the school district doesn't have those, they're not going to have those by the start of school.
And in terms of fairness and equity for all students, if students don't have access to the internet, the district has purchased wireless connectors. If you could just explain that to the public, or if you want Scott to explain that to the public, just so that everyone is aware that we've thought of everybody.
We have, and we started that last spring with hotspots. But Scott, if you want to talk a little bit about how that works, why don't you do so at this point?
Sure. It's similar to your cell phone. It is a wireless hotspot. It's a small device that can be placed somewhere in the home, and then the Chromebook or any other device that needs to be connected to it can get internet that way. So we do have a handful of them available as needed, and if we need to procure more, then we'll make sure we do that as well.
So the important message there, I think, to the public is that there will not be a connectivity issue, and that it's, there's equality across the board.
Yeah, well, the two issues addressed in the governor's guidance, which we addressed last spring, but will continue to address, are connectivity and access to technology. So in both instances, the playing field is leveled, and every student will have access to a computer, and every student will have access to connectivity.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Who's next, Scott?
So next up, we have Heidi Humes. Hope I pronounced that right.
Hi, Heidi, can you hear us? Heidi?
Heidi, you need to unmute.
Heidi?
Heidi, you have to unmute in order for us to hear you. Okay, so for now, we'll,
Okay.
oh,
Hello?
yes, go ahead.
Hi, Heidi. Please just give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. No, I'm Heidi Humes, and I'm just like I'm a child who has an autoimmune compromised parent, but one who I am thrilled to be back engaged in the system. But I'm just confused at, like, I've been getting conflicting information about the mask policy, about really kind of how this is going to translate, and I'm looking forward to re-engaging my son, but at the same time, I'm really nervous at, like, the ambiguities of what the real issues are. Like, I don't believe in the temperature. Like, my resting temperature is 97.4, as is my son. Like, if he came to school with a 98.6, he'd be sick. And I think the temperature situation is a much more ambiguous situation, as is masks and the actual mandate for the safety of the situation. But I also look at, like, we are in the extremely fortunate situation of having that football field in the back of school. And why aren't we utilizing that as a means to, like, getting these kids real instruction in person, which they're all craving, as are we as parents, truthfully, in just like a realistic situation?
So I think the two-part question that maybe you can answer, Jeff, sounds like the mask mandate, which I believe we are clear on, and Jeff, you can reiterate that, and 2, use of outdoor space, which I know we did cover briefly earlier. If we could just reiterate that, please.
So the mask mandate is going to be very clearly articulated to everybody in the school community. Students are expected to wear the masks, as are faculty and staff, at all times. And we will provide mask breaks outside, if at all possible, so that students can take off their masks for designated periods of time outside where it's not dangerous. And then with regard to outdoor instructional space, I touched upon some of the hurdles that we have to overcome logistically, whether it's staff. I didn't even mention security. It was only a year and a half ago, prior to COVID, that there were a number of concerns that still exist out there with regard to school security, school shootings, and things like that. Outdoor space certainly is not as secure. But in addition, we also have the whole issue of the remote learning program and synchronous instruction. And if we're outside, in many scenarios, that is not going to be a scenario that can be transmitted because of the lack of technology and internet access to those students studying at home. I know that, every answer we provide doesn't sort of answer all your questions, but that's the best we can do at this point.
I don't know if I'm here. I don't know if you're
Go
like,
ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, shoot.
So my other question is that I wasn't looped into this fact, and that's totally my fault as a parent, but someone has looped me into a fact that the school classroom windows don't open to the full extent. And I'm just wanting to be clear on if they are inside, is the ventilation system like a 4-inch window opening, or are they able to open fully functioning? I'm just trying to as I look at my child not being put on a plane, is it a 2-inch opening? Is it a 4-inch, 6-inch? I'm just trying to figure out what is the actual ventilation system that are allowed to our children?
So I'll speak to the majority of it, and then maybe I'll call on Mr. Malone. So in many of the classrooms, there are univent systems which can transmit air from the outside into the building as many as 10 times per hour. So every 6 minutes, the air is going to be exchanged with the outside. In addition to that, the district has ordered 145 air circulation or filter systems that either have HEPA filters. In fact, all of them have HEPA filters. Some of them have ultraviolet light as well, which has been demonstrated to be an effective block, if you will, for transmission of COVID-19. With regard to the windows that you're talking about, there are some windows in the building that are only able to be opened a minimum amount of space, whether it's 4, 6, or 8 inches. I'm not sure. Mr. Malone can speak to that. But we are in the process of reversing it so that the upper windows can open and provide more air circulation rather than the lower windows. Do you want to add anything to that, Mr. Malone?
I can just attest to the fact that there are stoppers on the windows for safety reasons, but actually after one of the discussions last week, Mr. Bedell, the lead custodian at the elementary school, and I went around, and the upper sashes do come down, so we're able to open those when needed to create more ventilation. Obviously, if we open all the windows in the hot weeks of September, that would impact the cooling capability of any air conditioning, but it would increase the ventilation. So we were able to check those, and we can do it.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Brian, next up we have Megan Schmidt.
Sure. Megan, can you hear us? Megan?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. Just give us your full name and you have 3 minutes.
Great, thanks. So it's Megan Curran Schmidt, and I just want to thank you as always for your hard work and all the heart that you are all putting into this incredibly challenging time. So much. For reference, our student is in middle school. I had 3 questions. The first is, you mentioned that the investment into technologies, into the synchronous learning is happening, which is great. And does that mean that the Teachers Association of Sag Harbor has agreed to live instruction being videotaped? Because I know that was of a concern to teachers, or at least to the association. My second question is that there are definitely groups out there considering private cohorting in terms of learning remotely together, so to speak. And I'm wondering at the middle school or potentially high school level, if administration would be open to aligning those students' schedules if when published they don't align, so that they could participate in that remote learning together. And my third question is, I know you just spoke to the HEPA filters, Mr. Nichols, but I was wondering, last I heard from one of these sessions that they were on back order, and I was just wondering if there was any update in terms of the arrival of those filters and how the district felt in terms about if they were going to get there in time to be implemented in all of the rooms that need them. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Megan. I'll try to do the best I can to talk about all 3 issues you mentioned. First, with regard to the technology investment and the status with the Teachers Association. So the intent was never to videotape the lessons. The intent was to live stream the lessons, so that if a student was at home and he or she elected to study remotely, that they could be viewing the lesson that was taking place in school from their home. There was, the Teachers Association took a step beyond what other teachers associations have done in an effort to cooperate with the district. And where other districts, the teachers had pushed back and said, we don't want any synchronous live instruction, our teachers union had said, let's leave it up to the discretion of the teacher, because there are some who are comfortable with appearing physically on the live stream, and there are others that would just want to have a video prompt. So in other words, their voice and the smartboard or the computer screen. We're in the process of working with TASH to come to an understanding of what the district is willing or can, from our attorney's perspective, demand of the teachers. And I think that we're pretty close to making that happen through constructive conversations with them. Our goal is to try to get that live streaming up and running before September 14th. And what I've talked about is not necessarily a live stream that follows the teacher around, but a live stream where you have a webcam that focuses on the smartboard and perhaps 5 or 7 feet on either side of it. So that when the teacher is up at the smartboard, he or she is seen on video, not other students per se, just the smartboard and the teacher. But if the teacher were to leave that smartboard and then go interact with students, that would not be viewable on film. Now, what I just described has not been agreed to by TASH, but thus far we've had very constructive discussions with them, and I'm hopeful that we can come to some type of agreement on that in the near future. Your second comment about families arranging private cohorting outside of school and whether or not the district could cooperate in trying to assist those groups by having their classes aligned in school, I would say that that's highly unlikely that we'll do that because we don't have the control mechanisms in place to ensure that equity takes place. There have been or equity is addressed per se. So one of the considerations is, and I'll just be brutally frank, that you would not want a group of parents outside of school with access to resources to set up an environment where their kids or their children have more than those kids or those families with less resources, and then have that continue to take place in the school given the grouping that the school sets up. So to clarify that, families are certainly free to set up the kind of groupings that they want to set up outside of school, but the school has to be very, very thoughtful and adhere to protocols and procedures in place that ensure equity when the students are in school. So I understand the thinking, but I don't think it's likely that we're going to assist in that regard. And then with your third comment, the Hepa filters, I continue to remain in touch with Mr. Wilkin, our facilities director, and he is exploring trying to look for these filters from other suppliers. And as of yet, hasn't had much luck, but we're going to continue to do our best to get them in prior to September 14th. And I'll provide updates to the community as information comes in.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
Scott?
Scott, you there?
I am. Next up, we have, well, the screen says Annabelle Rousseau.
Okay, please unmute yourself. Give us your full name and you have 3 minutes.
My name is Annabelle Roussel, and my question is whether you guys are considering putting siblings in the same grade, like twins, in the same cohort, so you minimize the amount of access, other people that the students are seeing in one family. And someone in the chat asked a really good question about whether kids during physical activity would have to wear masks, because that could be dangerous if they're wearing masks like N95s. So that was it.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I think the notion of cohorting siblings from families together would depend on whether or not they were taking the same courses. So cohorting them from a health perspective makes sense, but it only makes sense if in fact they were taking the same courses in school. So if they were taking, one student was taking English 7 and the other was taking, in 10th grade, was taking English 10, cohorting them together would really not be practical. It would be practical if they were in the same grade level, but the number of instances would be most likely limited to just twins. The second question with regard to physical activity, we are pretty limited in the types of physical activity that we will do, but let's say, for instance, we had a mask break and students were socially distanced outside, jogging or walking around the perimeter of the field, and they could maintain their social distancing, my expectation is that they would not have to wear their masks when outside in that kind of scenario. And obviously we would not obviously, as a clarifier, we would not be organizing activities where students would get closer than 6 feet. So my expectation is when outside, that hopefully the majority of time outside, they hopefully will not have to wear their masks.
Thanks, Jeff. Scott?
Okay, so next up, we're looking for Rachel D.
Hi, Rachel. Can you unmute yourself and hear us?
Hey, good evening. This is Michael D.
Hey, Michael. How are you? Just give us your full name again, and you have 3 minutes.
Michael D.
Very good.
First of all, thank you to all of you, both on the board and the task force, for all the efforts you all are putting in. I'd like to ask a clarifying question about Model 3A and the bell schedule, whether that will in fact be every day for all students. And the other question is whether there is a requirement for New York State to review and approve our final plan, and when that approval might happen. And are there any, is there anything in our plan that might be rejected? And finally, is there any possibility, Jeff, that this Florida study that you referenced at the beginning of the meeting could have a negative impact on the current plan and possibly force us to implement new social distancing requirements that that could negatively impact the plan? And that's it.
Thanks. Jeff?
Yeah, I'll go through. The first question pertained to scenario 3A, and in that instance, all students would follow the bell schedule. So if I was in cohort A and I attended school on Monday and Tuesday, then cohort B, which attended Thursday and Friday, would be following cohort A from home on Monday and Tuesday. And conversely, cohort A on Thursday and Friday would be following the bell schedule and the in-school studies of cohort B, again on Thursday and Friday. And Wednesday, all students, cohort A and B, would be following the bell schedule. In terms of the approval of the plan, New York State required school districts to fill out a survey where they attested that their plans would address, and it had a bunch of areas, and you basically check the box. And then school districts were required to post their plans to their websites. And that was supposed to be complete by July 31st. We did that. We received approval from the state that, in fact, we had complied with the guidance that they had issued. They had issued some additional guidance where schools had to, by last Friday, and I mentioned this in my earlier comments, post a COVID testing plan, a contact tracing plan, and the third element was a remote learning plan. And we did indeed post that last Friday as well. So to my knowledge, everything to this point has been approved by the state. The reality is that I don't think the state has the personnel to go over each and every plan. And that's why they had the survey filled out. And they're coming up with additional requirements to hold meetings like these so that the community can ask the number of questions that give them a full understanding of what's coming in September. With regard to your last question, I don't really have an answer. I know as much as most of the people who are watching tonight. I just read every day. But my sense is that the study that came out of the University of Florida that took place in a hospital setting potentially will have an impact if subsequent studies come out that correlate with it on the guidance that's issued to school districts and governments around the world. So if the research suggests that 6 feet is not sufficient and that it's 7 to 14 feet or 14 feet, then most definitely our opening plans and what's required in schools could change. But it's one study. Even the 6 feet guideline is not the standard that's followed all over the world. There is a standard of 3 feet that has been previously supported as being sufficient. So as more research comes out, I think that'll drive policies both in school buildings and around the world, in communities and cities and such. So we'll see.
Thank you, Jeff. Scott, next member.
Okay, so next up is Emily Whites.
Okay.
Hi, Hi, it's me again. Emily Whites McLean. Thank you for giving me another minute. So I just wanted to, I was surprised to see that there wasn't in the different options, there was no discussion of like a partial day opening and maybe having the students come in for 3 hours in person and 3 hours online in the afternoon or something like that, which I thought might be a good way to, you know, make sure they're getting the social, their social needs met, but at the same time also, you know, being able to have a mask-free learning experience and also at home and, you know, getting outside time and things like that. So wondering if you had given any thought to that. Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, we've given thought to all of the scenarios. And you know, Emily's idea was something that we wrestled with. And in our original scenario, which was scenario 2, I highlighted some of the practical economic concerns associated with prioritizing getting younger kids back to school. So obviously we had the science behind their susceptibility to the virus and their ability to be transmitters on par with the adult population, especially 0 to 10 years old. And I referenced the South Korea study. So that was one factor. But the other factor was the very real economic concerns related to those children age 0 to 10 requiring childcare. And so not only in Sag Harbor, but across the country and around the world, there's a desire to get people back or students back, younger students back to school because of childcare concerns. So we did wrestle with the notion of a split day, but if we were to go with a split day, that would impact people's ability to work and have to pay for childcare and those types of things.
Thanks, Jeff. Scott?
Okay, back to Megan Schmidt.
Hi,
Megan,
everyone.
please. Oh. Hey, Megan, just give us your name and you have 3 minutes.
Sure. Well, I was already on, so I'll take 1 minute, not to waste everyone's time. Megan Schmidt, and I just had a follow-up question in terms of scheduling. I know this is incredibly challenging, but I'm wondering when at the middle school, high school level, you anticipate the administration being able to publish or you know, in the parent portal or the student portal, the schedules for kids heading into the new year, you know, leading up to the 14th. Thank you.
I would say, Ms. Carriero, you've done a lot of legwork in this, so I don't want to speak for you, but my tentative thinking was in and around September 1st. But if you would like to weigh in with something different, please feel free.
I think we plan for every option. So we have schedules for every option for each kid, which seems crazy. We're just waiting to figure out what that option is and then fine tuning it, as well as making sure those cohort or pods are going to be successful. As we know, children have different opinions on each other, even though we want them all to love each other. So especially at the middle level. So September 1st would be a great time for doing that. as well as supply lists. I know people have been asking about that. We're going to be very thoughtful about that and try to limit the supply list as well.
Great, thanks. Mr. Malone, in terms of schedules, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. You know, my thinking is that the district plans to send out our survey middle or latter part of this week. And then we would review those results next week. And that would give us time to carefully finalize cohorts. And I think that September 1st would be a reasonable timeline, somewhere in around September 1, to release the student class assignment. I think we could, as Ms. Carriero pointed out, if we focus on a kind of standard supply list for families, we could release that a little bit sooner. So those two pieces will be forthcoming.
Great, thanks, Mr. Malone.
Okay, so next up is Julie Hatfield. I'm sorry if I'm reading it. Yes, Julie Hatfield.
Hey, please unmute yourself, give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes, Julie.
Hi, this is Julie Hatfield, and thank you for your time. I hear a lot of different priorities, especially you know, the younger children, pre-K, children with special education needs, English as a second language. What I haven't heard one word about are children in the IB program. And so in fairness and equity for all, could you talk a little bit about that? Thank you very much.
Sure. So in the scenario 3A, the IB program would be offered in full. So the hour requirement would be met. The students who are enrolled in the diploma program would have the capacity to complete the opportunity to complete the program, whether they're in their junior or senior year. So 3A, which is what we talked about, enables them to do that. Option number 2, which I did not necessarily endorse tonight. I said 3A was what my recommendation was that we go with. 2 would have also provided that opportunity for IB students, as well as option number 4, which would have necessitated larger cohorts in large areas in the school, like the gymnasium and the auditorium. So the only option that the IB program, as well as other elective offerings, would have fallen by the wayside would have been 3B, the hybrid schedule with cohorting. But in all other scenarios, the IB program will continue and the students should have the opportunity to complete the courses they would normally take.
Thank you, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Scott?
Next up is Melissa Mitchell.
Hi, Melissa, please unmute yourself, give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it's Melissa Mitchell. I just was curious. Thank you, of course, for everyone's time. I'm very appreciative of all the work that's being put into this. I just wanted to ask a quick question, like if a student tests positive in the building, whether, it doesn't matter what building, I know if they're in a cohort, then the contact tracing is a lot easier. So will there be like a written protocol that's published out to the parents and families that says like, at what point will the school shut down if we have positive cases, or how many positive cases? Like, will there be any protocol put out so we understand the steps that will be taken in the event that there are positive cases that come up?
So thanks for that question, Melissa. Thankfully, the Department of Health, the Suffolk County Department of Health, came out with a pretty detailed memorandum last week that provided guidance. So the school district's focus at this point is to make sure that we keep very accurate records of who is in what room at any given time. So you'll have the cohort of students, for instance, in a classroom, And then any adult or student who comes into that room will have to sign in and sign out. So if there is a positive test result, and bear in mind that a positive test result is what hits the red button, if you will, for the Suffolk County Department of Health to start the contact tracing protocol. If there is a positive test result, then the Suffolk County Department of Health reaches out to the school district within 24 hours, requests the information from the school district that they need to effectively contact trace that incident. Thankfully, we're going to be taking our lead from the Suffolk County Department of Health, and we will be putting out guidance, that guidance to parents so they're familiar with the protocols. What the guidance does not include at this point is what results in a school building closing. There is guidance that exists regarding who should quarantine if they're exposed to someone who tests positive, and it's within 6 feet, I believe, for 10 minutes of time. That's considered close contact, and that's laid out in detail in the Suffolk County Department of Health document. So to sum up, we will be putting out a summary of that guidance from the Suffolk County Department of Health. And we will be keeping detailed information about where students are in the building to assist the Suffolk County Department of Health should there be a positive case. And we'll keep documentation of not only where students are, but adults are in the building. And then finally, I do not have definitive guidance which speaks to when a building will close. I know that, for instance, in New York City, the public schools, they have come out with definitive guidance. Whether it's logical or not, I'm not sure. But out here that in Suffolk County, that does not exist as of this point.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Scott?
Okay, next up is Robert Getling.
Hi, Rob. Please give us your name, and you have 3 minutes. Thanks.
Hi, Rob Getling. How are you doing tonight?
Good.
I just had a couple of questions. What is the criteria for, I have a son that's 4 years old, be going into school. Is it inside all day or is it outside all day? And then my second question was, what do you do if a child that's 4 is crying and is upset since the teacher needs to be 6 feet away? And then for just thinking out of the box, for older students that say, I don't want to wear a mask and they're in school, what do you guys do?
So I'll start with, none of them are easy, but the one that
I know.
the one that's most straightforward is if a student doesn't comply with a rule of the school, then that student would be subject to the school discipline policy. So if a student doesn't wear a mask, they'd probably be sent home, suspended, those kinds of things. Obviously in a humane, reasonable way. So we pull the student in and say, hey, why are you not wearing your mask? You need to do that. If the student articulated his or her reason for not wearing the mask, we'd engage in a discussion and say, hey, we appreciate your perspective, but this is a school rule, you got to do it. And then that would follow up, if not successful, with a conversation with the parent where he or she would come pick up their child. I don't really have a good answer for scenario number 2, which is if a student's crying or upset, what does the teacher do? Obviously, the 6-foot rule is important, but if a student's in duress, we'll have to adjust. I'll let Mr. Malone speak to the second half of 2, maybe address that in more detail, and then talk a little bit about the inside versus outside piece, if you can, Mr. Malone.
Good evening, Mr. Getling, and good question. Definitely something that's come up when I've been meeting with and speaking with the members of the elementary faculty. It's a real concern. I think as we've mentioned with all these concerns, we're going to take every situation on a case-by-case basis while always keeping health and safety as our primary objective. I think one thing, just to create a little bit of reassurance, I hope, a focus across the district as we reopen, while obviously getting back to academics is important, we really all believe strongly in supporting the social emotional wellness of the children and setting the right tone for the school year and remaining cognizant that this is going to be challenging for everybody. So while that doesn't specifically answer your question, know that it's definitely on our minds and you know, something we're going to be very, very aware of when we work to reopen school. For the very young children, the pre-K and kindergarten students, we are moving forward with the plan to house the program at the newly renovated learning center. And it's a beautiful indoor space, but there also is outdoor space. There's a lovely playground, and there's also some room where the children can enjoy some other outdoor time. So we're working that into the schedule as a part of the mass breaks, as well as just normal recess and physical activity.
Okay. Because my son's been away from school since, you know, everything's closed and we haven't been hanging with many people. So it's going to be an adjustment period for him and a lot of other kids that are his age. You know, this has been hard on them a lot also. So it's just going to be the, like, you know, dropping him off. He might have a little bit of a freak out right there because, you know, we haven't done that in a while. So that's my biggest concern with, like, sending him back. I mean, we wear a mask wherever we go if we need to, but we haven't put it on him for 4 hours at a time, you know?
Right.
So this is it's a real concern for me, you know? Also, I'm just wondering, I've never seen the learning center. Is there any way of, like, seeing the space that the kids are going to be in? I know that's a big ask, but just something that was on my mind.
We could make a video and send it out to the community of the interior of the building and the exterior. Like I said at the beginning, we've got retaining wall construction going on in the rear of the facility, but that doesn't prohibit us from doing a walking tour on video and sending it out.
I think that's a great idea because that would alleviate a lot of parents' like concerns of like what the place looks like and stuff like that, you know?
Yeah, we'll work on that and get that out.
And there's also going to be remote learning if we choose to keep him home, right? If we keep him home, is there going to be remote learning also?
That is the plan, yes.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you very much for all of you being there. And I've been on all these meetings and I really appreciate your time and energy that's put into this.
You're welcome.
Next up, we have Jeffrey Greenwald.
Great. Jeff, just give us your full name, please, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, it's Jeff Greenwald. And let me first say thank you to everyone and all involved for all the efforts you've taken to ensure that we can go back to school safely. My question is, you've indicated that students may opt in and opt out of in-person learning at any time. What's the district's plan for spacing and/or social distancing in the event that the anticipated number of students opt in changes?
It's a good question.
Than what you expect.
You want me to start with that, Brian?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we did put out a survey early on, and when I say early on, I think it was about a month ago. And the number that came back was in the low 30s, I think 32, 33%, in and around there. Let me be safe to say between 30 and 35% that indicated that they would select the remote option. Our planning was factored on 20% of parents electing the remote option. So we feel pretty good that even if there's a drop in the percentage of parents that elect to keep their children home, that we'll be able to accommodate them safely while adhering to social distancing guidelines come September. If in fact that number decreases further over the course of the year, then we're going to have to revisit the policy or the plans that we have in place. So for instance, let's say we start at 25% of the students electing to stay home or their parents electing to keep their children home. And by November 15th, it's 2%, then we will have to revisit it. I think that's unlikely, but I would be misleading you if I said that a drop of 25 to 2 wouldn't necessitate revisiting the plan. I think it would. But there is some flexibility to go from, let's say, 30%, if that's what we start at, down to 10%. I think that 20% differential is something we can deal with. And the reality is, what would that mean? It would mean that we would have to consider, if there was a precipitous drop in the number of families who were pursuing remote learning and more people were opting to come to school, we would have to think about repurposing some spaces in the school to provide more flexibility. So that might mean that we're utilizing the cafeteria as an instructional space. It might mean that we're utilizing other parts of the building that we hadn't originally planned on utilizing. I think that we have to have a little bit of flexibility built into the plan. And someone might ask the follow-up question based on what I just said, well, if you did that right off the bat, then could we get everybody back? And the answer is no. We also ran those scenarios as well. But the plans that we have do have some flexibility built into them.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Scott.
Next up is Allison Norris.
Hi, Allison, please unmute yourself. Give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much for all you're doing. I just had a quick question about testing. Is it at all possible to have people tested before they enter the building? If not, can you just speak to why that can happen? Thank you.
So I can address that a little bit, Brian.
Sure.
Testing employees would be a term and condition of employment. And for those members of bargaining units or unions, whatever you want to call them, that would be something that would have to be negotiated. We have held some preliminary discussions with some of our bargaining units, and there does seem to be support for the notion of testing. And in fact, I know that the Teachers Association has surveyed their constituents, and there is a large amount of support for that. There is a cost associated with that and a logistical issue that we really have to look more closely at, and we're in the process of doing that. So I guess the big picture answer is we can't say that we have it all set up, but we haven't ruled it out. But we need to do more investigating in terms of the necessary agreements that need to be in place with bargaining units and associated costs. And just a word about costs. We're in an environment, people really don't want to talk about it, but I will. State revenues have dropped pretty significantly. 15 billion was the last estimate I heard from the state government, which means that aid to school districts is likely to drop. And that's not rocket science, because the economy has suffered and our unemployment rate is very high, and the revenues coming into the state are just not going to be what they were. At the same time, you combine that with some of the increased costs that we're going to incur, whether it's temperature scanners or maintenance for the Chromebooks that we're going to have to hand out, or additional staff, whether it's temperature checkers or general purpose teachers that are going to have to assist with a class of 24 being broken into 2 sections of 12. There are a lot of additional costs that we need to remain cognizant of and think about, number one, whether or not we can do it short term, and number two, what's the impact of that on not only this year's budget, which pertains to what I just said about whether we can do it now, but next year's budget and beyond. So again, the notion of testing, which I think is really an important question to ask, as with all of these recommendations, we have to look at it from a logistical perspective, but also a financial perspective in terms of what the district would be what the district would be willing to do in terms of expenditures in that regard. Because you could be looking at hundreds of thousands, if not more, dollars in annual expenses, depending on how often you tested.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, so
Scott?
next up is Jeffrey Greenwald.
Jeff, please give us your full name and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, it's Jeff Greenwald again. Just a follow-up to my previous question. Thank you, Jeff, for explaining how you would handle the potential influx of people opting into in-person learning. Just a follow-up to that would that plan include rearranging pre-existing cohorts or simply just adding students to existing cohorts that you've set up previously?
I think it's a good question. I think the answer is it would be dependent upon the numbers. So if I had a cohort of 9 students and I had 3 available slots in there and the additional influx of students could be accommodated while keeping that number below 12, we would consider that. If the cohort was already at 12, then it would be a situation where I would have to create another pod, if you will, and perhaps redistribute students. But obviously the thinking that would go into each of those scenarios would focus on the solution that exposes the fewest number of students to additional potential sources of infection. In other words, limiting the number of new contacts with the scenario that we ultimately came up with.
Great. So it's safe to say that you wouldn't be removing students from an existing cohort to place other kids in there.
That would most likely be the case, but I don't want to rule out anything, but the priority would be on coming up with a solution that minimized the risk for the students who are already in the school. So I think I covered it before, but maybe not comprehensively. It would be preferable if I didn't have to disband or to change an existing cohort because the students are already in that cohort and had been interacting with each other. So if at all possible, if I could add, I would, but if that group was already maxed out at 12, then I couldn't add, and I'd have to create another one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Scott?
Okay, let me see. Give me 1 second here. Looks like Stephen Breitenbach Jr.
Okay, Stephen, just unmute yourself, give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, this is Dawn Breitenbach. Actually, thank you. Thanks for your time. I have a question about the cohorts. The 8th graders have a lot of choices in terms of their classes. So I can see why you can't cohort the high school students. I'm wondering how you're able to cohort the 8th graders, because how do you find groups of 12 that are taking exactly the same classes? I mean, they have choices with language, math, science. What happens if they change out of a class? Are they're in a cohort with only kids who are taking the exact same classes that they are? I'm trying to understand how that would work.
You want me to take this, Jeff?
Sure.
Okay, so hey Dawn, I've been working on the schedule actually for that. We did 4 different rotations of what things are going to look like, and as we said and stated before, that cohorts are going to limit the different types of course offerings that a kid might be able to opt into. So their music choice or their art choice would have to be more streamlined. In that sense, we still honored the higher level courses that kids might have opted into, or if the family did not feel they wanted to do that. And those, for you that don't know, 8th graders are able to opt into taking, we have an open enrollment policy for living environment and algebra, as well as then there's the other version of that is Math 8 and Science 8. It's okay if the child takes either of those courses. We were able to honor that. However, for the music, it might look a little bit differently. We might have to streamline it, as we explained, as we needed to cohort the children to make sure of that, as well as honor their foreign language.
So big picture, what's the takeaway, Brittany?
So the takeaway is we cohorted as much as possible. The only thing that there might be a mix in is there might be 24 students that have Spanish and French, but we were trying to, depending on who opts in for remote, that might dissipate. So because we don't know who's doing that, it might go away. So there's 24 kids that might have a mixed thing, but otherwise they shouldn't. And for that foreign language option, and I might be able to have that live streamed if we did the synchronous learning. So that might be amended.
So of the 65 students roughly in a grade, let's say for argument's sake 65, then roughly 41 of them would be cohorted, and you could have 24 who have to mix, but that number could be less depending on how the foreign language shakes out.
And how and how the synchronous learning works out.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Jeff and Brittany. Scott?
That's all of the hands I saw. Oh, sorry, one more. We have Terry Federico.
Okay, Terry, please unmute and give us your full name, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, everybody. It's Terry Federico. My son is entering 9th grade, so he's new to the high school, and that's a grade that seems to have some of can go either way with the choices. But my first question is about the bathroom protocols. Will they have to be cleaned in between each student? I know you spoke about it briefly the last meeting, but if you could just touch upon that again. And then with the option 3A, that's with the no cohort. So this is one where the 9th grade is affected. Will those classes with the no cohorting still try to be kept to a 10, 12 number of students? And then the third is also with option 3A, because there's so much moving around with the students. That seems like it would be so much more complicated for the school to be doing the contact tracing, keeping the records. But that, I guess that would just simply be the attendance records of the teachers that you would be following. So maybe it isn't going to seem as more complicated. And then I also did have the same concerns with, as Jeff Greenwald, but you addressed it with kids coming in to the school, changing from remote to coming in, and then how that would impact, especially some of the high school students, again, with the no cohorting and such a variety in their schedules, and having to redistribute, would kids have to change a section or not? But I think I'm pretty clear on how you don't really know, but I think you did address that. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. I'll go through a couple of the ideas. We're in the process of working out how the bathrooms are going to be utilized and what the cleaning protocols are going to be. I know that I'm working with Mr. Wilkin to get seat covers, so that, this is not the stuff to talk about, but when you flush toilets, the fumes can spread the virus. So we don't have seat covers in the middle school, high school. So we're in the process of ordering those so that that's in place prior to September 14th. And I'm working with Mr. Wilkin on the cleaning protocols. I did speak with him earlier in the week. Actually, it was last week, and asked him to submit a list of new staffing needs that he needs or he requires to make sure that the buildings are cleaned to the new standard as per required by COVID. And so he submitted that list, and I'll be going to the Board of Education to advertise for the additional staff. Regarding the contact tracing, it's the attendance that's going to be taken by the teacher in the student management system, which is eSchool. But in addition to that, each teacher will have a log near his or her door. And any student or adult that comes into the room, in addition to those students scheduled in the class, will have to sign in and sign out. So the combination of the attendance roster and that additional log would be turned over to the Department of Health for contact tracing reasons, should there be a positive case. Now, one could have a follow-up question. Well, what about during transition times when students are going to some other class in the building or arriving in the beginning of the day? And that's where we just have to make sure that they're adhering to the 6-foot rule. And that when they're in the hallway, they're in their lanes and they're not within 6 feet of another student. And we've seen pictures in other school districts, most notably the one down in Georgia, where students were not adhering to that. And we just have to do the best we can to make sure that our students do adhere to it. And then finally, you asked about the cohorting in 3A. In that scenario, even though there would not necessarily be cohorting, because students would be taking different classes and moving more freely than in kindergarten through 9th grade, or kindergarten through 8th grade rather, would we still have class sizes of 10 to 12? And the answer is yes. So the class size limit of 10 to 12 applies in all of the scenarios, except for scenario 4, where we reference the utilization of large groups in big spaces. So that was where we would combine perhaps 2 instances of IB English, which might have 40 students, but the class would take place in the auditorium versus a regular classroom, which would allow for the necessary amount of distance to be safe.
Okay, that's all the questions we have.
Okay, great. A few questions, 'cause I know we had a lot, and we did cover a lot of these. But Jeff, it seemed there were repeated questions as when we're going to speak about cleaning protocols and cleaning and when this will happen, whether we're potentially, and I'm paraphrasing some of these together, if we're going to hire more staff for that, or every night overnight cleanings. If we have the plan yet that you or the administrators know, can we share that with the public or some ideas?
Yeah, we do have additional staff slated to clean. Mr. Wilkin, if you're on the line, do you want to talk a little bit about the misting machines that you purchased and how they'll be utilized?
Hello, everyone. We did purchase 4 Karcher misting machines that'll be utilized by our staff to walk around during school hours and after school to sanitize all the handrails, doorknobs, anywhere where somebody would touch, and hopefully will eliminate transfer of the virus from one person to another. At least we'll try everything possible to prevent it. We also, while I'm on right now, I'll talk a little bit about the Hepa filters. We did purchase 120 units for the classrooms, and we purchased larger units for the large spaces like the gym, the libraries, cafeterias. The large units we got in. The smaller units are on back order, as Mr. Nichols said earlier. I did hear a word from the supplier that there's a good possibility that they might be in this week. So I'm hoping for that. Also, what was the other thing?
So Paul, are there machines that the night crew would utilize in spraying rooms after the students are gone?
Yes, that's what those Karcher machines are.
Okay, so you had mentioned handrails and things during the day, but those machines will also be used to clean the classrooms in the evening after the students have left.
Right. They'll be going through the classrooms and spraying the desktops. So basically any horizontal surface. It's a very fine mist that has a virucide in it. So as it sits on the surface, it'll kill whatever's on there.
And these are additional protocols that have been issued since COVID-19 emerged.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Are there any board questions or anything the board would like to state for the public at this time based on procedure or how we're going? And if not, we would proceed to a regularly scheduled part of our business meeting.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you so much, and I want to thank the public for being so participatory in this process. It's so helpful. Just a couple of questions. One is that, let's see, we've had a couple of questions about what the date is that the board has to vote on what the plan is. So if the superintendent could speak to that about when that date is, I think that'd be helpful. Secondly, I really appreciate all the work that's done. I wanted to share with the public. This is, I mean, I've been on the board 11 years. This is such a complicated environment where for every move that the district makes, there is a group of parents and community that is really thrilled. And there's a probably equally large group that's frustrated. So, you know, I can vouch for all the hard work and that the intention is to really try to do the right things by the students and by the staff. I do think that the opportunity to give families a chance to switch at any time, let's say from remote to being in, having their children attend the school district, it's an admirable thing. I'm concerned that it's going to be problematic logistically. I'm afraid that at any given time, you make the administration may get inundated with calls that parents might not want to send their kids. And I'm not sure logistically how we can switch quickly. So I would just say that we need to take that opportunity at every turn and to say it may or may not work to do quickly. We may have to take more time than a few days or a week. But anyway, so I wanted just to check on the date of voting of the plan. And also I wanted to suggest, I think that it would be really helpful to have a simple Q&A on the website. We're hearing some of the same questions meeting after meeting, which is understandable because we have parents who can join some nights and not others. But I do think that there's common themes for every time we have one of these meetings. So if we can create a Q&A that can be posted and shared, it might help address a lot of the questions so folks don't feel like they have to necessarily dial in to answer them. So that was it for me.
Great. You want me to speak to those?
Thanks, Chris. If you could, Jeff, yes, please.
Sure. So regarding the Q&A, our nurses have done a wonderful job with the health and safety portion of our plan and actually came up with a Q&A this past weekend. So I wanted to sit down for at least this meeting and maybe one other before putting that out, but it sort of speaks to the comments that Chris just made. So that'll be posted shortly to the website. Regarding Chris's comments about, you know, the opportunity or the approach to be flexible being admirable, but she's worried about some of the logistical concerns. I think that's, comments are legitimate, but again, phrasing our response to the community as we will accommodate what we can accommodate as long as we adhere to the safety protocols established by DOH, whether it's social distancing or cohorting numbers, provides us some flexibility. And my comments before, and Chris was accurate, said a couple of days to a week. If it's longer than that, then that's what it has to be. I think the alternative to that in terms of establishing minimal amounts of time that people have to stay in a specific choice is much harder to defend from a legal perspective. And that's based on conversations with counsel. And then lastly, with regard to the vote of the plan, As per our council, the board really does not have to vote on the plan. And the portion of the plan that is really up in the air at this point is the middle school, high school plan, because we've talked about the elementary and K through 8 for the most part being in session every day. And my recommendation as of this evening, knowing that conditions on the ground can change, is to go with 3A, which is a K through 8 every day and a 9 through 12 hybrid. And I make that recommendation, and I'm being a little bit redundant because I said it earlier, but I want to reiterate that I know that the science suggests on the one hand that a hybrid model, having students in school without cohorting, it doesn't make sense in terms of limiting the spread of the virus because you're not able to cohort. So I know that that's counterintuitive, but I also have to, in my recommendation, consider two other things, which are the detrimental effect of having students at home 100% of the time remotely in the high school. And we know that there is a detrimental effect associated with that. And number two, we work for the community as well as the students under our charge and their parents. And there was strong opinions that were voiced with regard to option number 2, and specifically opposition to having 10 through 12 study 100% remote. So that's a summary of my thinking in terms of what goes into what I am recommending, and I'm recommending at this time option 3A.
Great.
So as a follow-up question then, at what point, is there a date in which we're committing to what option as a district we're going to move forward with?
We're moving forward with 3A.
Okay.
As of today, but I've said this all along, and you know this, is if the conditions on the ground change, we could be in an entirely different boat, come September 5th or 6th,
Right.
or 7th. Thankfully,
So if the conditions change and get worse, this state has parameters in which we may have to shift. If the conditions stay good or get better, then that's the option we're moving forward with.
correct.
I think that's helpful because I think there's a misperception that the board is having some official vote on some official night.
No.
So
yeah, I think it's important,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
There is, I think that's important what Chris said, just to reiterate that there is not an official vote or this, Jeff, as the superintendent, has decided with his administrative cabinet that we're moving forward with 3A. So 3A is our opening plan unless conditions change, which is important for the public to know as of today. Any other questions, or we will move on to our business meeting? Sandy, I can't hear you. Sandy, we can't hear you.
Sandy, unmute.
Sandy, we can't hear you.
My internet went in and out.
We can hear you now.
We're just hearing you now.
All right, sorry. Do you know when you'll be sending, or are you going to be sending a letter to all district-wide employees and our school community about people who possibly
Just went out.
Maybe she types it in the chat.
Or Sandy, your internet connectivity might be better if you turn off the video while you're talking. I just a thought.
I think I'm back. Am I back now?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Yeah. They asked if you are planning on sending a letter to all the district employees and school families on quarantining for 2 weeks from different states that they're at.
Yeah, we actually sent that letter out, a memorandum to all teachers and staff. But we will be sending it out. That was a couple of weeks ago, but we will be sending it out to families as well, along with a series of communications regarding the latest developments on COVID. There is a part of, and Scott, you can jump in if you want, but there is a link on the website when you go there for all the COVID related updates that we've posted throughout. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a whole dedicated to all the updates for Coronas.
Yeah, but specific to your question, Sandy, I think it's important to send something out soon with regard to the return to school and some of the things people need to be aware of.
Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, seeing or hearing no other questions. No other hands are up, correct, Scott? I don't see any. Do you see any at your end?
I do not see any.
Okay, thank you for everybody. We will again, just to reiterate, be having a meeting tomorrow at 6:30 as well as Thursday the 20th at 6:30. At this point, we are going to move on to our consent agenda. So is there a motion for consent agenda items 7.2 through 7.10?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Okay, Victoria, please open up the voting.
Brian, can I make a comment?
Yes.
I just wanted to thank Truman Yardley for his donation of books to the library. Thank you so much. And as always, we appreciate donations from the community.
Thank you. Yes, we do.
Waiting for Yorgos to vote?
Yorgos, I believe, dropped off the meeting.
Okay, so mark him not present, that's unanimous.
Thank you. Item 8.1 on the agenda. Is there a motion for item 8.1?
So moved.
Is there a
Second? I'll second.
Okay. Discussion. I think it's just important to note that this is the correction to the school calendar. So the first day of school will be September 8th for teachers and faculty and staff to return, and students will be first returning to school on September 14th.
I also wanted to just raise an issue, just given that we're looking at the calendar. The board had received an email from Mindy Ryer, Joan Dudley, Emily Whites McLean, Bobby Cohen, Chris Klein, Chase Malia, Erica Arnold, and Shannon Marr regarding renaming Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day. I know we've had a lot to talk about, so this might not seem as much of a priority given everything with school, but I wanted to just raise it since we are talking about the calendar at this time. I looked into it some more. I know Potsdam, New York, their district has renamed Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day. I've had some communications about Southampton. This came up with Southampton. Of course, the reservation is right near there, so it's a really important issue there, but also in the East End generally. And so I just wanted to raise it. In Southampton, I think where they ended up is they just no longer call it Columbus Day. They just call it no school. So wanted to raise that. And then also Juneteenth is I believe New York now actually recognizes it as a holiday. Columbus Day is still recognized in New York State as the holiday. 10 states in the United States plus Washington, D.C. are now calling it Indigenous Peoples Day. So just wanted to kind of put it out there if there was any appetite for addressing that at this time, since we are approving a new calendar.
I don't think it's the appropriate time to address it. I think we should put it on for a discussion at a later date so that members can be prepared to discuss that and the public could weigh in if they want to. So my position would be, I think we should schedule it for a later date, but I'm happy to hear whatever the other members of the board want to say.
Brian, I first of all, Trinidad, thank you so much for raising it. I'm really glad you did. Brian, I understand the idea of postponing the discussion. I am concerned about approving a calendar then that we might want to edit going forward. So before we make that move, I would ask for a recommendation from the superintendent.
So, and I would just to clarify that, Chris, this is the calendar we approved back in the spring with the correction of the starting date. So
Right,
that was the
because
only change.
Right, the starting date's changed, but I think what's been raised is some issues about certain holidays that are identified or not identified, and what they're recognizing or celebrating. And that's come up since the last time we approved the calendar. So, and I believe that some of this feedback came from our, from one of our key committees, right? Is that correct, Jordana?
I think it's a subset of the.
It's a subset. It wasn't from the committee.
A subset of one of the key committees. So I guess because it's being raised as a suggestion to amend the calendar we have now, I don't know if we have a recommendation from the superintendent, but I'm asking, you know, if there is a recommendation, if we can hear it.
So, so listening to the conversation tonight, my recommendation would be that the district approach it in a measured, thoughtful way, and that you're not really required to make a decision tonight or next board meeting or whatever. But I think, Jordana, I don't want to speak for you, you put it on everybody's radar that this is something that you would like the district to consider and contemplate. So the recommendation would be that we do that through the course of this year, knowing the calendar is at where it's at this time.
Thank you.
So what I would suggest is that we don't wait till we approve the calendar in 10 months or 8 months for next year, but maybe we tee it up sooner. I mean, we have a lot on our plate now, obviously, but I don't know if we should wait that long to have that conversation to say, should we be amending the calendar, particularly because other districts have done that and done that successfully in you know, more of abbreviated time. So
I think that there was no suggestion as to putting it off, Chris. I agree with that point, but the point was so that the public knows tonight when they're going back to school, which would be in relation to COVID. So
right.
My intent on
So
moving
I'm not
forward,
suggesting we don't approve the calendar tonight.
Can I finish?
Yeah.
My intent was to not put that off for 10 months, but to take action tonight so that the public in making preparation for their children to return to school knows what day it returns to school. And that we can then have that at a meeting upcoming, soon as, you know, end of this month or right in September. I wasn't intending to put it out long, but I think it's important that people know when they're going to start school so they can make those plans sooner than later. But
I agree with that suggestion.
again, what the board thinks is I'm happy to move forward on. So I think there was a motion and a second. So with the caveat that we will put that on for an upcoming meeting when members can be prepared to discuss that and the public can be available to discuss that. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
we could open the voting up, Victoria.
What am I voting?
Calendar.
Thank you.
Change the kids' start to school dates from the 8th to the 14th.
Thank you.
No
Got
other
it.
changes.
Great.
Okay, that's unanimous with Yorgos not present at vote.
Okay, moving on to agenda item 9.1, which is the Communications Committee. So Jeff, I know you were doing some work at pulling out the old charter on that. I don't know if you could just give us a status update so we can work to schedule to move forward on this.
Yeah, I think I have Maria Domchek, who's my assistant, working on that. And what I'd like to do is forward you a more comprehensive summary of what the previous charge was of the committee with some recommendations. And I would like to get that to you later this week in the weekly update.
That would be great. My individual thoughts, I'd like to get that established and running prior to the start of school, because I think that's going to be a key component of having a successful school year. So if we could look to have that in the next week so we can review and have an action item on for the board to review at the last meeting in August.
That sounds like a plan.
Any other comments from the board with respect to that?
I think it's definitely something that we need to get up and running as soon as possible. Even though we're in the middle of all this craziness with COVID, I still think it's important, especially now more than ever, to keep people updated, especially tonight. I think, people want to know about the Hepa filters. There had to be 25 come across the chat. If we just had simple Q's and A's and let people know that there's a COVID page that they can go to read up on these things, I think people would just have a little bit more ease, and it would definitely make these meetings more helpful and more productive for us. So I'm ready to do whatever you guys need to help get that committee up and running.
And great. So if we could, we'll review that charter, Jeff, that you get us
Yeah,
this week.
How about if I have the summary and the recommended format to you guys by the end of the week so you can act on in the meeting the end of August?
That would be great.
Okay.
Sounds good. And I have, if anyone needs it, I was part of the freshman class of that committee, and I have documentation on the previous recommendations and all that. So if you need any information, I probably have it.
That would be great if you could forward that to me. Thank you.
You got it.
Okay. With that, we would go on to item 11, which is new agenda items. We don't have anything in that column tonight. And with that, we'd move to column 12, which is public input. So if there's anybody here that wanted to discuss with the board, now would be the time in public input. Just raise your hand and Scott will arrange to unmute you.
I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, we'll just give it a second. And appears to be nobody. So we will move on to, is there a motion to convene into my paperwork correct? Executive session to discuss matters pertaining to specific non-union employees.
So moved.
I'll get a link sent around to the board in a sec.
Great, thank you. So there was I'm sorry, Lisa, you guys spoke.
I motioned.
Okay, Sandy motioned and Susan seconded?
Yes.
Okay, so great. So if we could open up the voting for that, Victoria. And so the public knows the board will not be taking any action aside from closing the meeting when we come out of executive session. And Jordana will be sending that link to board members now.
Thanks, everybody who tuned in tonight. Appreciate all your input.
We'll see everyone tomorrow.
Just waiting.
Yorgos is not here.
I'm waiting on Jordana.
One second, doing two things at once. Voted yes. There we go.
Okay, unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see everybody in a minute.
Yeah.